Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call our meeting to order, please. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I'd like to welcome you again to this afternoon session. My name is Pamela Mbabazi. I'm an associate professor of development studies from Mbaro University of Science and Technology, which is Uganda's second state university, and currently in management of the university. It's a very big privilege and honor for me to be here this afternoon and to moderate this panel of our very eminent academics, scholars, practitioners who will be talking to us this afternoon on a very pertinent topic of the role and impact of emerging powers in sub-Saharan Africa, in line with the general broader thematic issue of this project. I think that the role of international actors in Africa's extractive industry is very detrimental, and we are looking forward to listening to our eminent personalities here. It is my pleasure to introduce them, and I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Elm A. Rice. I'm sorry if I pronounced it right, not correctly. Dr. Elm is a research assistant at Yase University in Turkey, and she received her PhD with the dissertation Federalism and Conflict Management, the Cases of Nigeria and South Africa. Her latest research focus has been on the potential of federal principles and institutions on conflict management processes in South Africa, especially in the transition period 1994 to 1996. And Dr. Elm will be talking to us this afternoon on the topic of economic relations between Turkey and Africa, the challenges and prospects. You're very welcome. I'd like also to, in a special way, introduce our other presenter this afternoon, Dr. Lu Haifang. Dr. Lu Haifang is the Deputy Director and Secretary General of the Center for African Studies, Peking University. We're very pleased to have you here this afternoon, especially given the growing role of China in Africa, and would like to listen to your perspective in looking at how this all is playing out. Dr. Lu is an associate professor in the School of International Studies, as I indicated, Peking University. She previously worked for the Institute of West Asian and African Studies, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and is a visiting scholar at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in Netherlands. And she'll be talking to us on China's influence in Africa, current roles and future prospects in resource extraction. And the other presenter this afternoon is Dr. Benjamin Aogi. He's from the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, and he's a research fellow, and this institute mainly deals with global issues, but based in Paris, and the focus is mainly on oil and gas governance in Africa. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Africa Energy Intelligence and has been for the last 6 years. We're very honored and privileged to have you this afternoon, and without further ado, I'd like to invite our first presenter, Dr. Elm, to talk to us. Please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Well, okay. Yeah, my presentation will be mostly about Turkey's economic and commercial relations with Africa, both on a bilateral and multilateral basis. But I first have to say that for long years, African issues were largely ignored in Turkish foreign policy, and the engagement with Africa was considered as secondary in foreign policy circles. So not only political and diplomatic relations, but also economic relations were therefore at the lowest level for long years. So ever since the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1920s, it has been the modernization along with westernization was perceived as one of the major tenets of Turkish foreign policy. So developing relations with African countries were not regarded that important, and the independence of African countries also was not recognized at the first level. So improving relations with Turkey's NATO allies and being a member of European Union was the major tenet. So until the adoption of the Opening to Africa plan in late 1990s. So within the presentation, I will first focus on the increasing interest of the Turkish government on African issues. So if you see at the official rhetoric right now, the first two quotations are from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Turkish government now perceives the African countries as one of the prime orientations of Turkish foreign policy and regards Africa as a continent having many promising developments. So the last two quotations are from the prominent book of Strategic Depth of our current Prime Minister and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has been a major architect of Turkish foreign policy, especially in the last decade. He considers Africa as a continent which a country like Turkey should that no longer have the luxury to ignore. So what he basically argues is that ignorance of Africa, as the former governments did, would certainly constitute an unwarrantable mistake. So there have been some important domestic and international considerations in influencing his foreign policy decisions. So I will just briefly mention about the major motivations behind Turkey's rising interest in Africa, and then try to analyze the major challenges and prospects, especially on Turkish-African economic and commercial relations. So there have been some domestic and international motivations, as I said, and the most important international driver has been the rising interest of great powers on Africa, especially in the very last decade. So this had a direct influence on Turkish foreign policy, but there was also some domestic considerations as well. So the short-term objective was to become a non-permanent member in the UN Security Council, and the African countries having a great voting power therefore had occupied a greater place in Turkish foreign policy. And the second middle-term objective was to improve commercial and economic relations with African countries. This is actually the bulk of the presentation, so we'll be giving closer scrutiny in the following slides. And the last domestic consideration is actually the desire of the Turkish government to become a regional and maybe eventually a global power. So this required to follow a more multidimensional, proactive and dynamic foreign policy, and this also required to improve relations with the regions that were once neglected, not only the immediate neighborhood of Turkey. So with the opening, we see a greater level of attention paid to African issues, but Turkey's economic and commercial relations actually focus mostly on the desire to create markets for Turkish products, so rather than importing African natural resources. So the last one is also a motive, but the basic drive on Turkey's economic relations, the desire to improve its commercial and trade relations with African countries is based on to find alternative markets for Turkish products, actually. So as I said, this all began to change with the Opening to Africa plan in 1998, but some domestic instability, some economic crisis, and also lack of logistics impeded its implementation until 2002 with the Justice and Development Party. The action plan had various measures in various fields, but the economic measures were the central part of the plan. And there are many principles, many provisions on economic measures, but they basically aimed at increasing trade volume, firstly with African countries, both in a bilateral and multilateral basis, and increasing the investment level of Turkish companies, as well as increasing the number of Turkish companies investing in African countries, and Turkish banks as well, and the signing of some trade agreements like free trade areas and preferential trade agreements, so on. And following the action plan, we actually see an increase in Turkish companies who started to invest in African countries, and the direct investments of those Turkish companies also increased dramatically, so which one could not anticipate until the very recent past. And the number of offices of the commercial councillors are also increased, and Turkish government signed revised trade agreements with many of the African countries. And those are all in line with the Opening to Africa plan. And now Turkey is accepted among the 7 emerging economies in Africa, and it has been among Africa's 20 trading partners in 2008, also among top 5 investing partners in 2011. So various summits and meetings were held, and they are still held in both in Turkey and in African countries, including foreign trade bridge programs, ministerial review conferences, and some meetings with the African Union. So, but what I basically would like to do is to continue with some recent data, but before proceeding, I would like to say that the construction sector is the sector that Turkish companies are more actively operated in. So the number of Turkish contractors increased, especially in the last decade, but they generally operate in the Northern African countries, let's say. So this is a long table, I know, but it covers the period between 1997, the year before the African Opening Plan was adopted, and until today. So as you can see, in 1997, before the adoption to African Opening Plan, the export of Turkey to Africa was slightly more than 1 billion in 1997, but today it has reached, we see a steady increase, and it has reached 14 billion in 2013. Although, of course, it can't be compared to some of the emerging countries as to that of China or India or European Union countries. And as for the import data, we see a decrease first in 1999. Actually, it is the year when Turkey experienced a huge economic crisis and an important earthquake which caused the lives of, in the official numbers, 15,000 Turkish citizens, but in the unofficial numbers, 50,000 Turkish citizens, and it is assumed that 600,000 Turkish people also remained homeless. So it was a year where Turkey did not only have domestic instability with all these coalition governments and this earthquake and economic crisis as well. So we see a decrease following this year, but especially from 2004, we see an increase, and 2005 is the year where it was accepted as the Africa year, and we see a steady increase from starting from that year, but still, especially the import data with Northern African countries is not that significant at all, but for Sub-Saharan Africa, it has increased 8-fold in 17 years though. And $2.5 billion all these exports have been from Sub-Saharan Africa. So I have written as other Africa because it's the usage that is preferred in all these Turkish ministries and the official documents. And here you can see that the Turkey's import from African countries is actually slightly more than $6 billion in last year. And here you can see better the place of Africa in Turkey's overall trade, so the ratio of our trade with African countries among other country groups. So although the trade and economic relations have increased between African countries and Turkey, the African countries still occupy a marginal place in Turkey's overall trade data, which might be accepted as normal to some degree because the European countries, along with European Union countries and non-European European Union countries, and Middle Eastern countries and Asia as well, they are accepted as Turkey's traditional trade partners ever since from the establishment of the Republic. And Turkey has a huge dependence on its energy imports, especially from Russia and some from Central Asian countries. So the import from other Asia, so there's no Asia in here, but still it is defined as other Asia. It explains this energy dependence, especially on Russia. And you know, I'm sorry about the mistake. But it's the export in here, and it's for the exports. It's you know, higher than the import data, but it's still, you know, as you can see, African countries still has a marginal place in Turkey's overall export data. And if you look at the percentages, Africa, along together with North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, constitute only the 2.4% in Turkey's overall import data, and export data are also less than 10%, especially if you look at if you compare it with the European Union countries and the Middle Eastern countries, it's not that high at all. So. And Turkey's trade with Africa concentrates on major trade partners. The 5 major export partners of Turkey in 2013 are all from Northern African countries, of Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Morocco, followed by South Africa. So the trade volume with these 10 African countries constitutes more than 80% of Turkey's export. And the major import partners of Turkey in 2013 has been Egypt and South Africa, and those two countries occupy nearly 50% of Turkey's import. So Turkey's trade volume with African countries indeed concentrates on major trade partners. Well, I just don't want to go into detail to all of those data, but well, the theme of the conference is Africa's natural resource governance, but so I wanted to put something about Turkey's contribution in that regard, but we don't see that much of contribution because Turkey mostly focuses on its you know, exports to Africa rather than importing some natural resources, and Turkish companies, as I discussed before, Turkish companies mainly focus on increasing their trade markets or to find some alternative markets. But you know, Africa, according to the African Natural Resources Center, you know, Africa holds a large amount of natural resources in the world, and it is also believed that there are some undiscovered oil resources as well. So this interest on the continent's large quantity of resources, especially oil and minerals, is also visible in Turkish foreign policy, although being not the major driver. So in the Africa Energy Forum held in Turkey in 6 months ago in Istanbul, Taner Yıldız, Turkish Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, emphasized Turkey's determination to invest in African energy sector. But here the most important thing is that he says that Turkey would like to do it in a way to help African countries benefit from natural resources extracted from their own territories. So in nearly each and every address, each and every speech of senior Turkish officials, including the Prime Minister, President, and Minister of Foreign Affairs, they try to focus on Turkey's difference from other countries, especially from former colonial countries. They always say that Turkey lacked a colonial record, and Turkey would like to pursue a relationship based on win-win relationship, mutual dialogue. So in each and every speech, they say that Turkey is different from other emerging countries or from other great partners investing in Africa. And in one of his speeches, Abdullah Gül, the former president, even said that we are different from Europeans. We will not have your raw materials and then leave. So we never run after our own interest, and we know well how self-interested states brought to Africa. So the Turkish officials always try to focus on that. The international community should understand that we see Africa as only equal partners. Here you see Davutoğlu, the current Prime Minister and former Minister of Foreign Affairs. What he basically says that Turkey is involved in African affairs for Africa, and he tries to explain the importance of Africa to the other deputies in the parliament, because in in the initial phase when Turkey started to increase its relations with African countries and focus on the opening to Africa policy, this policy drove a lot of criticism from many experts, from many senior officials, and from journalists as well, who basically said that the focus should be, to increase our relations with Western countries and to initiate the reforms that is required to become a new member. So this actually drove a lot of criticism in the first years, but right now we see that it began to reverse, and in the following years, following the adoption to Africa plan, Turkey increased its diplomatic presence in Africa, tried to improve its relations with regional organizations. The Turkish government is also determined to increase its flows to African countries, so the scholarship provided to African students authorized, and the flights of Turkish Airlines have also dramatically increased, so it flies to 48 destinations right now. So those are all seen as positive developments, and this had implications on the academia as well. So the academicians starting to study African affairs or Turkish-African relations have also increased, which one could not anticipate until the very recent future. But although both political and economic relations are on the rise, we see that trade relations are still below the anticipated level and phase. For example, in 2007, it was expected to increase trade volume to the level of $30 billion in the very near future, but after 7 years and following nearly 17 years after the adoption plan, we see that it's still below the half of it. And but trade volumes with African countries increased from $3.4 billion in 1997 to $20 billion in 2030, corresponding to nearly a 600% increase. But I still, I'm maybe that pessimistic at all, but I just want to conclude with an African Union document referring to the Istanbul Agreement, which was signed in 2008 after the meeting of the first Turkish-African Cooperation Summit. The document basically says that Turkey-African partnership has enormous potentials, but its rate and scope of implementation will need to take off, because as of now, not much progress has been made in terms of the implementation of the Istanbul Agreement, which aimed at developing cooperation in various priority areas, including trade, infrastructure, agriculture, education, culture, tourism. But I really would like to say that this development in Turkish-African relations could not be anticipated until the very recent features, and I really would like to hear about the African responses, how African countries perceive Turkey's engagement in Africa at all. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elm, for that very brilliant expose. I think Dr. Elm has done a brilliant job in explaining to us more about Turkey's strategy of opening up to the Africa plan, its aims and focus, and the whole strategy and action plan that it took. I think she explained in detail the steps taken by Turkey to penetrate Africa with largely the aim of finding markets for its products, and also highlighted what its main strategic partners have been. I think that we have indeed gotten a broader view of how Turkey has increased its presence in Africa, and there are some lessons to be learned from how Turkey has undertaken this whole strategic engagement. Now, we will wait for the rest of the presenters also to present, and then have a round of discussions at the end. So I'd like now to invite Dr. Liu to also give us her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thanks to the organizer for the kind invitation. It's a great honor for me to come here to dialogue with each other and learn from all your excellent jobs. And then, unlike my previous colleague who talked about Turkish relationship with China, with Africa, I would rather focus on China. And I think my job is a bit simpler as well as difficult because Turkish relationship with Africa may be still new, but China-African relationship has been rather like common knowledge. And then people still may have some myth understandings or misperceptions about China-African relationship, but simply there are lots of information available, and also if you visit the different continent, I'm sure you come across easily all the agendas about China-African research. So in that sense, my job is rather more difficult, more challenging, try to unpack from this sector perspective to learn about what kind of influence that China has so far brought to Africa in resource extraction. And first, I want to say, yeah, as I said, there are lots of attentions that has been drawn, and then there are also rather common hypothesis, which looks like a very scientific, very popular as well, about why China come to African resource. And this understanding really coming from the understanding about China itself, Chinese own development agenda, its own path. This is really talking about Chinese own demand, and also the Communist Party government, how it want to satisfy its people by providing lots of economic opportunity, therefore to stabilize the society. And then this kind of a hypothesis has been very popular among scholars. And for me, actually, when I try to study China-African relationship from this perspective, I am not satisfied, because if you follow this theory, this hypothesis, you are rather guided by kind of a China is a kind of a monopolist body. It's only one actor. But when you talk about China, actually you always have to ask which China you are talking about. And it's a company, it's government, it's a public sector, or it's private companies, or it's non-governmental. So they all have very different agenda, although from popular understandings, assumptions that China is a kind of a one body, but I will try to explain why I think if we try to understand China's African presence only through this one body myth is not enough. And yeah, of course, we come back to the question why China need African resource. There are lots of statistic numbers to show us how China's import from Africa mainly, almost 80% are resource. And the mineral resource also, the not only energy resource, also other non-energy resource. So all this kind of things have been rather driven by the huge number, huge volume of export and the import have been driven by Chinese development indeed, especially how to urbanize, and also its export-oriented economy, really relying on lots of external resource. This is quite true. But I want to go back to the Chinese own energy situation to 1960s, when China received Soviet Union's help and developed its own resource extractions since 1963, and it became a very self-sufficient in terms of energy. So this is a Chinese situation during the Cold War era. And in 1985, China reached its peak of energy exporting. So remember that year, China was an exporter. But then you realize that China started its reform since the beginning of the 1980s. And then this kind of economic reform developed so fast. So even only in 1993, China started to import oil. And then it becomes a net importer and then the biggest importer since last year, compared, even competed down American. So this is the Chinese own situation from the energy perspective. Then if we say the situation how China started to import, and then the changes through this charter, you can see easily. Initially from Asian Pacific and the Middle East area, China got its oil. And then since 2003, exactly this year, the benchmark, and then China put more emphasis on Africa. So Africa became agenda for Chinese energy security really starting from that year. And then the other two following year, we actually see dramatic changes from Africa. From before 2003, the proportion from African oil is only about 17, and then 2004, sorry, actually the proportion increased till 30%. So this is how Africa become more important for Chinese energy security. And there is one famous talking among Chinese leaders that if you don't increase the import of oil, you are not responsible leaders. So, which really means that how this economy really relying on import of energy. But other than this, energy resource, also we can say the non-energy resources are increasing a lot. And then there are lots of different types of need. This is a trade from the graph about Chinese trade with Africa in 2010. We can see clearly mineral is holding about 80%. But if you look at other resources, it's also very diversified. It's across many things. But this is also a graph remind us China is not only doing extraction in Africa. Actually, mainly the resource, the energy resource coming from Africa is still through trade. So which means Chinese investment, FDI, is not that successful, not that prominent yet in Africa. So if we break down the whole investment into different sectors in terms of a stock, we can say a situation like this. Instead of the myth about Chinese presence coming to Africa only for resource, we actually find the investment very diversified across so many different sectors, and the mineral actually is only less than 30%. So this is something very useful for us to talk about China's presence, or why China come to Africa. And just as I said, compared with other prominent companies from other countries, Chinese company from Africa, it's such as if to compare with American ExxonMobil, you actually get 1/3 that in total Chinese extraction from African oil. And of course, even this limited activity, still China got the most criticized about how China is supporting the RUG states, and China even started to have lots of diplomatic approaches yeah, you probably already heard about. We have, during the Darfur crisis in 2008, Chinese set up its the first official special envoy of African affairs, initially only focused on Darfur issue, and later on now it's becoming an African affair envoy, special envoy. And then the person now is rather working currently still the South Sudan and Sudan affairs. So if we go to detail about Chinese resource development, investment in Africa, we have this type of a situation. We do have the investment coming to the mineral. Seriously, okay, I'll try to skip some of the things. We do find the investment easily goes to those mineral countries, but it's really diversified, also goes to other non-resource countries such as Ethiopia. And my good friend Fentu keeping on telling me how Ethiopia has been changed with the Chinese presence greatly. So also we know the Chinese investors, not only the officials, the governmental, state-owned company are coming. We actually see there are lots of other smaller or private company are coming. These are some major project. I just try to skip, and yeah, you already know that there are lots of criticizing regarding to Chinese presence in resource sectors, not only because the transparency issues, also it was said about China rather undermine the Western government's pressure on the public scrutiny issues of oil, and also those mineral countries has been rather cursed, and is even worse by the Chinese presence. My approach is if we want to have a whole comprehensive, rather comprehensive perspective, we will have a better understanding regarding to all these things, and the African, what kind of a benefit that Africans has been benefit from Chinese presence. We not only find that African has more leverage to the previous players, we also know that the different agenda has been there, the controversially since the beginning of this new centuries, such as especially during the time NEPAD was established. But the Western agenda has been driving the African countries focusing on democracy agenda, while Chinese model simply shows that maybe you could also take another alternative choices, which is rather development agendas. So I think this might be a different, or at least help us to understand the Chinese contribution better. And I think, yeah, this is a comparison between Chinese import of African oil, only actually 11%, and all the rest still, the majority goes to Europe and Africa. I want to quote one American energy expert, his comment about Chinese presence. Actually, he emphasized while most American companies rather trying to only buy back the stocks, Chinese actually invest more money for investigations and the new oil field. All these activities actually help the whole global energy security by diversifying the supply. So that's his point of view. And he even said that this help the Americans' national interest and energy demand. So this is something I think would be rather helpful for us to understand Chinese role. And since I have very limited time, I just quickly use 1 or 2 minutes to finish the prospect. Yeah, currently the Chinese presence in Africa faced a lot of challenges. So from an enterprise's perspective, they actually rather lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding about the local society. Therefore, they really have a long way to learn. And from Chinese government side, how to provide a better regulatory framework is a great deal for Chinese government to keep up. But on the other side, on the other hand, we also understand the serious situation in African environment. How in the morning we've been discussing about the political issues, corruptions, all these things heavily related with the Chinese activity as well. So far, for Chinese government, how to learn to be balanced between these security challenges as well as your new prominent position as a great leader, as a big power in the world is something very challenging. And yeah, as I said, these Chinese companies have lots of deficit for social license. So we have lots of bad cases, and then Chinese government are forcing them to learn how to provide better social responsibilities through many measures. And in future, we can say that different from the Chinese government strategy, which only emphasize the energy as well as other non-energy mineral securities, the company actually starting to localize their presence in Africa, not only because they are facing all these challenges, therefore they realize that not only the investment and then the way how they work in the local environment, all this how to be dealt with through the collaboration with the local partners. And then on the other hand, we also do say more private companies are coming, which means that without the policy instrument from Chinese government side, they already got to know the local environment, they got their networks locally. But another challenge may be raised also how to regulate this private company is also very challenging. And I wanted to break down between the Chinese energy resource and the non-energy resource to speak to you about the new challenges, but I think I will escape from all this. But I try to emphasize how since 2006, when Darfur's crisis happened, the Chinese president actually, he issued one thing, and this is actually a great change for my understandings. Before that, you know, Chinese emphasized non-interference policies, principles, all will, and now the government, the president emphasized we need two things when we go to Africa. One thing is the stability of the oil state itself, and the second is the benign political environment. At the same time, if you remember, 2008 was the year that Chinese opened the Olympic Games. It suddenly became so prominent players in the world, and also plus 2010, the GDP became the second. So all this make Chinese realize the sense to be a great player is so important. How to carry out your responsibilities is very more important at this time. So this economic demands plus this political sense of carry responsibility in the world together, and then so I would rather say Chinese how to do more. The government need to provide more regulatory framework for its company, not only the state-owned company also. So I will just close with one new report really I actually prepared one thing maybe very controversial among scholars of Angola model, how Chinese use its financial instrument to encourage the mineral companies coming to Africa. But I wait, maybe we can chat over the Q&A sessions. And then I conclude with one report which I actually received from this NGO Global Witness. Just right at the time I took my wing to here, and they actually through this report you can say that Chinese government joined these international organizations to release a new guidebook about how to avoid this type of a conflict mineral supply chain, how you supervise the supply chains, which is very, very new, because not only because Global Witness hasn't been allowed by Chinese government, also in terms of Chinese, the past route, very difficult to work with the international organization. But if you go to say the specific criteria of this new guidebook is rather repeat what OECD and American government's regulatory framework. So these all are new things. Not only you see on the ground that Chinese companies are starting to working more and more with the local partners as well as other international companies, therefore pick up what they have done as a kind of experience. And also from Chinese government point of view, you say the regulatory framework is getting more and more intensive, more and more diversified. Therefore, maybe we can see a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, for that very elaborate presentation. I think Dr. Liu has presented very well and explained to us why, despite the myths and misconceptions about China-Africa relations, it's important to understand clearly the type, nature, character of Chinese engagement and investment in Africa, and whether it's state-driven or non-state-driven or private sector-driven, and what the impacts have been. I think you explained very clearly how this huge demand for energy has, in a way, defined and characterized China's trade relations with Africa, and how diverse the whole investment is across the different sectors. And I think you've really helped us understand, even from the China perspective, the challenges that are being faced in this investment, mentioning issues like the regulatory framework, security challenges, understanding the unique contextual realities, and how China is now beginning to respond and highlight this. Thank you very much, and we will immediately push through to our last presenter this afternoon, and request you please to take the podium, Dr. Benjamin.
I'm going to talk about oil and gas in Africa, and I'm not going to be able to talk about every case per case, but I wanted to concentrate this presentation on three main topics. First one is the oil companies. You have different type of oil companies. Second is the oil countries. We're going to see a little bit the difference between the different oil and gas producers. And the third part would be concentrated on Eastern Africa, especially on Tanzania and Mozambique, where you have a very big game changer that is in preparation in the coming years. So as I am a scholar in geopolitics, I'm going to focus and to try to work with maps. So this is the map of Africa, as you can see, and just to make a little bit of history before beginning on what's happening right now, exploration in Africa has begun in the 50s, mostly by major companies: Chevron, Texaco, Shell, Conoco, ELF, the French company. And it has been very useful because lots of countries have been put in production in the late 50s, namely Algeria, Nigeria, and Gabon in the late 50s. But it was really limited in terms of exploration. So the majors have concentrated most of their funds in these specific countries where they found oil and gas very easily, very fast. In the 70s, you have also some new companies that are coming because they have more funds thanks to the two petroleum shock of 73 and 79. So they have more funds, and they are trying to take some more risk in Africa, in African countries where you have a very underexplored basin. And the third phase, which is the current one, is since 2003. Since 2003, the price of the barrel has skyrocketed, as you know. It has reached $147 in August 2008, and you had lots of new players that are coming. So the major are still playing a very big roles, especially in very well-known basins like Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, etc. But you have a lot of junior companies that are created just to explore Africa, or that are shifting the exploration strategy and they are taking a very big lead on Africa exploration. So this map, you have some majors and some junior companies. Right now you have about 40 countries under exploration in Africa. So since 2003, more and more exploration. So the only countries where you have absolutely no exploration right now are in white. So Burkina Faso, no exploration whatsoever. Zimbabwe, no exploration whatsoever. Djibouti now has some exploration, it's in white, but it's not correct. And all the rest, so mean what is in green, it's producing countries. What is gray, it's exploration country. So you have exploration in Zambia, in Malawi, in Madagascar. So all the continent, almost, you have some exploration right now, thanks to this price of the barrel that is really high and that allow new players and former player to invest a lot in this new frontier. But you have also other players that have helped a lot to unlock the potential of this continent, is the national companies. So you have the majors that are private companies, you have juniors that are private companies, and you have state companies. So this is the four maps I've done. The first one is regarding China and Japanese investment. The second one on the top, Brazil and Malaysian investment. The one on the bottom, on the left side, South Korea and India. And the last one is Russia. You have two colors for Russia because you have some investment that are coming from state company Gazprom, which are in blue. And you have private investment from Lukoil, which are in kind of purple. They are not coming from the same reason, all these companies. And we have to make some differences between them. Of course, China, India, Thailand, Korea are coming to try to find some oil because they need to secure the supply. They have very limited supply. As you were saying, China is a big producer, but they are importing 5 million barrels per day, so it's enormous. But for the case, for instance, of Brazil and Russia, they don't need to bring energy to their country. Brazil has enormous reserves of oil, more than 50 billion barrels, and Russia, as you know, is the more important producer in the world, before Saudi Arabia with 10 million barrels. So they just want to invest because they know they have the know-how, they have the money, so they just want to invest in other countries to try to use their knowledge to make some more profit overseas. So they don't have the same goals, but it adds some more money, some more exploration to this continent. So you are adding majors, juniors, state companies, and you have now 40 countries in exploration in Africa. So it's quite new. This is not, it wasn't possible like 10 years ago if I had spoken to you. So in green on this map, you have all the producers of oil right now. 19 countries are producing. You have the big circles that are black. The more the circle is big, the more the production is big. As you can see, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, of course Nigeria, Angola are really the main producers. And you have lots of other producers that are really way more little. What I was telling you about the new phase since 2003 has also helped some new country to be producer. So, like in Chad in 2003, new producer. Mauritania, 2006. Ghana, 2010, even though Ghana has produced some oil in the past, but it was really limited. Since 2010, it's way more important. Niger in 2011. And the next one will be Uganda within 2 or 3 years that will be put in production thanks to this new phase. So you see you have new actors that are coming on the market that were not producer before. Either because we didn't know that they had some oil, or because the oil was too limited at a certain time where the price of the barrel was really little. It's the case of Niger. We know there is oil in Niger since more than 20 years. Same for Chad. All the Chad reserves have been found in the 80s. Same for Sudan. We know there is oil in Sudan since the 70s, since Texaco, and it has been put in production in 1999. So it really depends on the situation, on the price of the barrel, the budget of exploration of the different players in Africa. So this is a little figure for all the producers. You have the first column with the production, the second column with the reserves, the last column with the first year of production. And you can see how it's very diverse. And Nigeria, 2.4 million barrels per day. Mauritania, it's 8,000 barrels per day. So they are consuming more oil in Mauritania than they are producing because they have some mining and they need a lot of energy. But even I'm not going to pick all the examples on this specific figure. But for instance, Nigeria, 2.4 millions, it's really nothing compared to the reserves. They have 37 billion barrels, and because of security issues, they are still with 2.4, 2.2, 2 million, very little. It makes like 10 years that every expert is saying that they could reach very easily 5 million barrels. Because of instability, especially in the Niger Delta region, they can't reach this specific 5 million barrels. But it's very easy. They have the resources are there. There's no problem about it. But you have instability, you have security issues, so you cannot put that on the markets because there's not enough investment that are made in the region. Same for Libya. Libya has the biggest reserves of oil in Africa, 41 billion barrels. 1.6 millions, it's nothing. I can remind you that 30 years ago they were producing 2 times what they are producing before the Gaddafi fall. So they were reaching 3 million barrels per day. And before the Gaddafi fall, 1.6 millions, because underexplored country, because no money, because of all the embargoes, etc. But the resource is here. You know, we can just put in production way more barrels on the market. Let's move to gas now, which is something very important. So as you can see on the maps, there are 2 colors, the red colors and the orange colors. The red colors are the countries that are exporting some oil. All the others are using the gas just for their internal consumption. Okay, so Algeria export, Libya export, Egypt has exported, but it will stop very soon. Nigeria is exporting, Equatorial Guinea is exporting some gas, and Angola, the new pupil of the class, are exporting some gas since 2013. All the rest are using mostly the gas to produce electricity or for chemical plants. Okay, so you can see Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Congo, Brazzaville, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. I will come back after on Tanzania and Mozambique. And of course Tunisia, that is not exporting some gas. So 14 producers of gas and only 6 net exporters. So they are really limited. And in terms of reserves of gas, it's 7% of the world reserves. So it's really limited, 500 TCF, trillion cubic feet, whereas in the world it's more than 3,000 cubic feet. So it's a little actor, but what is interesting is that for the oil and gas market, most of the hydrocarbons that are produced locally are exported, about 70%, oil and gas, because the internal consumption is really little. So even though they are producing not an enormous amount of resource, almost 70% are exported. So it's important for the oil companies, it's important for the oil consuming countries to invest in Africa to secure the supply of energy. So this is, sorry, some words are in French and some words are in English. As you can see, the more important producer is Algeria. I'm still talking about gas. Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea. But the problem, for instance, for Algeria, the production is going down and down and down. It's not because of security issues. It's because since 2005, there is a new code, a new oil law, if you prefer, that is obliging all the major companies to give 51% of every project to Sonatrach. And since then, you can see that all the investment are decreasing little by little. Now, in terms of exploration, 82% of the exploration of Algeria is done by Sonatrach, meaning there's no more investment by private sector, almost nothing. And it's figures from Sonatrach. So because the regime are too harsh on the private sector, you have no more investment. The 4 last oil bids that have been done by Al-Naft, which is the body that is handling the oil and gas sector, has been a disaster. Like 2 bids for 10 blocks, something like that. And the last one had just been done 6 months ago. So they changed a little bit the law, but it's still not good enough for the oil and gas companies. So it's a very specific case, a very dangerous case, and in the same time they are consuming more and more gas. So now they are consuming 30 billions of cubic meters are consumed in Algeria, and they can export 50. And this margin is going little by little to decrease. So it's quite dangerous when you have an economy that is really little diversified like Algeria. Nigeria, it's exactly the same. I will be done in 5 minutes. Nigeria is a little bit the same, but not for the same reason. It's because of security issues. All the oil and gas is concentrated in only one region, which is called the Niger Delta. And because of security issues, and because the oil companies are waiting for the petroleum industry bill since 2007, they don't really want to invest a lot of money in Nigeria right now, and they prefer to put their money somewhere else, like in Brazil, or Latin America, or Azerbaijan. As I said, my third and last point would focus on Eastern Africa, and not Eastern Africa broadly. I'm not going to talk about Uganda, we can talk about it later. But in 2 countries that are really going to be game changer, not in Africa, but in the gas market in general. If we can say that there is a gas market, but at least regional gas market in Asian zone. So since 4 years, you have very intensive exploration in the blocks that are in yellow on the northern part of the offshore of Mozambique, that you can see, and on the southern part of the offshore of Tanzania. The companies that have been involved in the operatorship of these blocks, Anadarko from US, Eni from Italy, Statoil from Norway, ExxonMobil from the US, and BG from Great Britain, have found about 200 TCF within 4 years. So in 4 years, they found more gas than in Nigeria in 60 years, okay? And they're consuming very little gas up to now. So most of this gas will be exported in the next coming years. And what they are talking about is about 50 million tons per year, which is half of the production of Qatar. 4 years ago, we hadn't any idea about this. You can talk about with geologists of major companies that were saying there's nothing in Mozambique, there's nothing in Tanzania. Why put some money over there? And now they have 200 TCF. So it's absolutely enormous, not for the country, not for the region, not for the continent, but for the entire regional market. We don't have only Australia, Iran, Qatar that are going to supply some gas to Asia. We have to count on Mozambique. And this is enormous field, like one field about 60 TCF, Prosperidad field in Mozambique. So it's very easy gas to extract. Of course, it's greenfield project, so it would take a long time to be put on production. First gas will be put in Mozambique thanks to an FLNG, so a boat between maybe 4, 5, 6 years, maximum 6 years, by Eni that knows exactly how to do it. It's not a little company, they have did it many times before. And in the end, we can reach 60 million tons per year. So that's really enormous. It's not that well known because it's very recent, but it's there. It's really there, and it's big. The last thing I wanted to add to this specific region is you have other countries that can be very interesting. The north of Madagascar, I did the blocks, the yellow blocks. It's ExxonMobil there. They're going to drill some wells next year. It's 160 million, one well. So if they're going there, they might have some idea about it, could be interesting. And Comoros, the island in, between Mozambique and Madagascar, have given their first oil blocks 6 months ago. So it's a new frontier, but we have already enormous reserves, and you can have some new players in the coming years. Just to conclude, I wanted to say I didn't take a country per country, etc. It's a very diverse continent. And the story of oil and gas in Africa, it's each country per each country. You don't have any model. It doesn't mean anything to talk about Africa, as it was said this morning. Uganda has a model, Ghana has a model, Nigeria has no model, Gabon has its model. Everyone has taken a different path. And when you are talking to Mozambican, for instance, in Tanzania, the way they see how investor can help them, or even some private donors are helping them, are really different. In Mozambique, they are okay to take advice. They are ordering reports and reports on the same questions, etc. But in the end, they will take the decision by themselves. They are really nationalist. In Tanzania, because of the cultural, because of the political history, they are really suspicious about what's coming from overseas. So if you are Norwegian, if you are Nigerian, it's the same. You will be seen as someone that might rob the state. So they are really suspicious. So every country have a specific model. And last thing I wanted to add is one of the things that is really hard, especially in Africa, but not only, is the legal system that is always changing. You have new law all the time that are pending since many years, or that has been done every 2 or 3 years when you have a new regime. And the oil and gas companies are really scared by that because they need to invest for 10, 15, 20 years. And in Africa, you have many, many codes that are under rewriting process. And as I said, in Nigeria, it's since 2007, and it's a very big risk if you want to attract some investment in your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin, for that very elaborate presentation in which you presented very well the different actors and companies in Africa's oil and gas industry and where this exploration and production is taking place. I did pretty well get clearly, and I believe all colleagues understood, how of recent we've seen many new entrants in this whole sector, and how it's important to understand the different models in each country and how this is all auguring and how it will actually impact differently in today's global political economy. So thank you very much, and I'd like you to join me in thanking our presenters for a very good presentation. And as we transition into the discussion, I want to apologize. I think my time management has been a little bit problematic, but I think that the issues that were being discussed now are very pertinent, and it pretty much talks to the whole theme of this project in understanding really how different actors are engaging with Africa. And I felt that it's important for us to really grasp and understand the different perspectives as we open up the discussion. Now, before we do that, I hope that you will indulge with me and allow us to probably eat into our tea break and enable us have a more fruitful discussion. But before we get into the discussion, I was requested by the organizers to talk a little bit, 5 minutes or less, on the emerging oil industry in Uganda, given that I'm here. And I thought that I would tell you a little bit briefly on what is going on in my country, especially as you've talked about each country having its unique issues in terms of this whole growing industry. Just as a bit of a brief, I know that we probably all know differently about what's happening in Uganda, but the broadly speaking, the Albertine Graben region in western Uganda has been confirmed to contain commercial oil and gas resources. And this is the area that forms the northernmost extension of the western arm of the East African Rift Valley. This area is shared between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which poses, of course, a big challenge in our exploitation of this oil, because as many researchers and critiques have indicated, it's pretty much a time bomb, because at some point we probably will be asking each other as nations where the boundaries actually form. But Uganda can indeed benefit from oil, but only if it's managed properly. Unfortunately, the history of oil exploitation in developing countries does not augur well for my country. Nevertheless, it's not inevitable that Uganda will repeat the grave mistakes of other countries, but if we are to avoid these mistakes and derive tangible benefits, I think it's important that we understand clearly why oil production has proved to be very problematic around the world and what this implies for the sound management of oil revenues. And I think this is why the discussion we're having today is very important, and I find it very insightful for me, because unless we really understand what seems to be working on the continent and what lessons we can learn from that and build from that, I think that it will be a little bit of a challenge for us as a continent to know how to benefit from this oil and probably see, like a country like Qatar, how you've been able to make this advance. Now, government has been promoting the exploration of gas and oil over the last 25 years, and of recent, several wells drilled have encountered gas and oil. It's estimated that the in-place volume of petroleum in the country is over 6.5 billion barrels, with approximately 1.4 billion barrels of oil recoverable. Now, this volume is very dependent on how the production of oil in the different fields will be carried out, as this largely depends on the reservoir quality, the oil properties and technology used in the production. To date, over 1.5 billion worth of investments have been made in the sector, and more is anticipated. Exploration work has only been undertaken in less than 40% of the Albertine Graben region, which I talked about, so there's still to be a lot to be discovered. Now, Uganda has been moving rather carefully and systematically in trying to put in place a governance framework for this emerging oil industry, and we currently have a national gas and oil policy whose aim is to use the country's oil and gas resources to contribute to early achievement of poverty reduction and create lasting value to society. And two pieces of legislation, the Petroleum Exploration, Development and Production Act of 2013 and the Petroleum Refining, Conversion, Transmission and Midstream Storage Act of 2013 were assented to by the President only last year and became effective. The Public Finance Management Bill was also recently passed. Alongside this, a petroleum authority is supposed to be created to regulate the sector, and the national oil companies to be put in place to undertake the state's business. And at present, the key oil companies licensed in Uganda's oil industry include, of course, CNOOC, which is a Chinese company, Tullow, a British company, and Total, the French. The first petroleum production license in the country took effect only last year in September, and the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, CNOOC, was issued a production license over the Kingfisher field, which is the largest well. And this has opened the transition period from exploration to development in preparation for production. However, for production to take place, of course, we need the necessary infrastructure, and this, to me, is the bigger challenge, because we need huge resources to achieve this. Now, Uganda has also opted to have a refinery built in trying to address the issue of not only exporting crude oil, again, trying to learn lessons of what might perhaps work on the continent. But this will require an investment of approximately $4 billion, and it's expected to have this developed under public-private partnership approach. But in my view, there are so many challenges in our country which will undoubtedly impact on our ability to attract foreign direct investment and the kind that we attract. One, in my view, are the levels of corruption. I think Uganda of late seems to be hitting it high in reaching alarming levels of corruption, and although I must mention that, yeah, government is trying to deal with this. There is a lot of challenge in that aspect. So obviously, the type of foreign direct investment we attract in the country will very much be dependent on the level at which we're able to control our corruption challenges. The second issue I feel is the strength of our institutions to regulate this very intricate sector. I want to argue that Uganda has very weak institutions, and indeed for many Ugandans, we have very little trust in our ability of our institutions to manage this very big industry. I conducted a study recently in understanding people's perceptions locally about our growing industry, and it was clear to see that quite a big number of Ugandans tend to believe that our institutions are very inefficient and unable to govern such a complicated resource as oil. And the issue of lack of transparency is another factor. I think that, yes, the government has of today released only partial details of the production sharing agreement to Parliament, and these have not been disclosed to the public, and this lack of transparency has been very divisive, and in my view unnecessary, because if you let the public know, I think it works out better eventually. The last issue I wanted to point out is, again, the whole issue of the failure of many other African countries to manage their resources, the inability of states like Nigeria, arguably Angola and DRC, etc., to use their vast resources, resource wealth properly, has cast a global skepticism about managing our resources, and this tends to impact on how you attract foreign direct investment. So these, in brief, are some of the pointers I wanted to mention, but I think, again, I tend to believe that perhaps it's high time as Africa, looking at what seems to be working. The context in which we're operating today is different from how many of these other countries have managed, and it's important to really get back, especially as academics, to understand what seems to be working on our continent and what can we do to understand better how this is working and use that to then find different models and unique contextual models that can make this happen. So I want to end up there and open the discussion. I am terribly sorry, but I'm hoping we can have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 questions which can preempt our presenters to respond, and hope that this conversation can continue through. Thank you very much. I'll begin with the arm behind. I think we'll take like 4 or 5 questions and then allow our presenters to. The gentleman at the back, and then we'll come through. I can see a lot of questions, I'll see. Thank you.
Quick question on Turkey investment in Africa. What do you say about the Eastern Africa in particular? What do you think that, because I've seen rush from the Turkish side in the eastern part of Africa for the last 4 years. And my other question to the gentleman is, there are a number of companies that are going to even not so safe countries and trying to get license, or at least, I mean, concession from the governments. Even Somalia, I've seen that at the moment some British companies were rushing to that. Even though there are no legislations or, I mean, governance systems that can handle this thing. What do you think is driving this rush?
Thank you. Would you be kind to introduce who you are briefly and also indicate who you are addressing in terms of the question so that it's very clear? Thank you. Please, to the next table in front of you, the 2 gentlemen will move through. Either of you, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Franklin Lisk from the University of Warwick in the UK. My question is directed at the presenter from China. Although I must admit I enjoyed all of the 3 presentations very much, and they were quite informative. Now, I am interested in your presentation because from my humble position, I have a collaborative project with your university, in fact with your institute, Professor Wang Yang, the China-Warwick, China-Africa relations, where we're trying to contextualize the China development model in African development paradigms. And I've visited your institution, and I've also had the privilege of participating in a seminar which involved a number of African ambassadors in Beijing last year in February, and met with your special representative on African affairs, Professor Zhang Yuan. Now, I liked your presentation because you highlighted 2 points which are not widely known regarding China-Africa relations. One is the reference to the report which I have actually read on the Global Witness. And this is a very interesting report because one of the areas of criticisms relating to China-Africa relations is the fact that the Chinese have gone in to mess up the existing donor-recipient relationship. But this report is important because it's a report which, if I recall, is based on something commissioned by the China Chamber of Commerce on minerals and metals. And also it comes up with groundbreaking guidelines relating to, and even propose ambitious standards relating to wide-ranging aspects of responsible corporate behavior, including conflict prevention, labor standards, and environmental protection, as well as participation in local community activities. What I want to know is whether this report itself has had any impact on Chinese investment in the sector. The second area is relating to Chinese soft power, which I would like you to elaborate on. Again, this is an area that is not well known because recently Professor Kenneth King, who's emeritus professor at Edinburgh and has done a lot of work on China-Africa relations, came out with a book which emphasized Chinese contribution to human capital development in Africa. And I was amazed when I read this book to find out the extent to which there is substantial Chinese investment in human capital development, including the number of Africans who are studying at technological institutions in China. I'm not talking about the Confucian institutions in university, but I'm talking about solid technological capacity development, which is not often highlighted. And I think China should take pride in this and try to, because one of Kenneth King's argument, in fact, is that China is making a far greater contribution in this regard to human capital development than Western countries. Would you mind elaborating on that? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is George Kararach from the African Development Bank. My question actually goes to Benjamin, and I also have a query for Pamela. To Benjamin, you gave us that beautiful map where over the years, I think, Africa just went green, almost. And in line with the theme of the conference, what is your sense in terms of the evolution on economic diversification, development? What contribution has all this turning green meant for Africa in general? And is there any trend on accountability, for example? You mentioned the issue of specificity, that every country has a specific tendency, but is there any common thread maybe in the how people, for example, locally, benefit from this turning green, as it were? Because it would be interesting then to figure out if that is not happening, what could have gone wrong? And that takes me to Pamela, and it's linked to the turning green thing. In Uganda, the evolution in the politics has been that there is now an attempt at ring fencing. By ring fencing, she probably can explain it better, but I read it in the papers, that in the Appletine region that you spoke of, there's an attempt to say, you know, you couldn't come from northeastern Uganda and run for local politics in that region if you do not originally come from that part of the country. And I'm not sure whether that interpretation of ring fencing is correct for me. But the issue of corruption that you spoke of, my own concern is that corruption is actually in government. So the attempt by government to get rid of corruption in government is like government trying to get rid of itself. And I wonder whether actually the real issue is not just corruption per se, but general failure in governance. And I wonder what your views are on that.
For gender balance, I think I'll take her and then come to both of you, and then we'll respond, please.
Hello, this is Rawa Kalasina from Al Jazeera channel. And my questions go for Dr. Haifang. First, I have to say that I felt that your presentation was mostly defending China from all the misconceptions, as you said. But when you say that the hunger hypothesis is not true, and then you mention poetically that millions of poor farmers are working hard and silently because they want to buy TVs, cell phones, and laptops, that just makes the hunger more humane than machines and factories needing energy. And when you say that it's a fact that people, countries around the world, they cannot live anymore alone, and that they need other countries to supply their resources. So it's not an accusation when people say that you are in the end importing 30% of your consumption from Africa. But what I find a little bit disturbing is that you made it sound as if Africa should turn to China because China in return will not give them moral lessons like the West. And on the long term, when China will become the first power, economic power, is the non-interference in that sense viable? And is non-interference, when you say we don't ask for transparency, isn't it interference by accepting corruption and by accepting non-accountability?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رامي عبدودي من الجزائر، صاحب شركة في قطر. السؤال موجه للدكتورة ألين. هل يوجد هناك تنسيق وتعاون بين تركيا وقطر فيما يتعلق بالاستثمار في أفريقيا، وهذا في ظل العلاقات الاستراتيجية المتميزة بين قطر وتركيا؟ وما هي صور أشكال هذا التعاون في حالة وجوده؟ بالنسبة لسؤال الدكتور بنجامين، دكتور بنجامين تكلم أنه توجد بلدان غير إفريقية لديها نفط ولديها غاز أكثر من إفريقيا. لماذا التركيز بالضبط على إفريقيا؟ لماذا يعني التركيز على إفريقيا مع أن هذه الدول تملك؟ ألا يدل هذا على أن هناك علاقة استغلالية لإفريقيا؟ ألا يؤدي التركيز على إفريقيا إلى استنفاذ ثروات إفريقيا بالنسبة للأجيال المقبلة؟ وشكرا.
Just a very interesting panel, just two questions to situate, or two comments to situate my couple of questions. One is whether the declining price of oil and gas will change some of these assumptions. And secondly, in the whole panel, I didn't hear any mention of Qatar, and I wondered if that's symptomatic of its marginalization. The specific questions I have, firstly, to Liu, I recently looked at the book by Howard French on 1 million Chinese in Africa. You didn't mention any Chinese in Africa. Secondly, I'm interested in Benjamin's paper in terms of African agency and whether the gas in Tanzania and Mozambique may yet translate dependency into agency. Thank you.
I think I'll take the last question. We're running against time. Yes, sir. And then we will have to cut it there and allow the presenters to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Panel, my question comes to you. I know Uganda, just as you said, Uganda has passed a number of legislations in the face of accountability challenges, not just in Uganda, but on the continent. To what extent has Uganda involved the local citizens in the formulation of these laws? Because what happens in other countries is that there's a disconnect between the framers of the law and the very people for which the law are supposed to govern. and the industry. And eventually, the effect stare at us in the face. So just want to find out from you, to what extent was the populace of Uganda involved in all of these?
Thank you very much. I think that Dr. Liu had most of the questions, so I'll give you the opportunity to respond first and allow the rest of presenters as I crown off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the various very interesting questions. I try to answer one by one. First, the question about whether this report from Global Witness has some influence from MOVCOM. I hope I pick up the right question from you, Professor. Yes, thank you. Yes and no. Why that? Because Global Witness came to China around 2009 when I was still working for Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I knew they didn't have a good relationship with the Chinese government because their headquarters based in London, so they got enough suspicion from Chinese government. They have been struggling with their presence. Even now, they cannot register their branch, but they do allow to have their office and have their activities, just like other global international organizations such as WWF. I ever worked closely with WWF, also working for China-African relationship. They have been designing an initiative called Shift China. This project means to try to help Chinese government to make sure their aid and investment is green enough. So MOVCOM actually joined WWF 2012 to release their very first guideline about how to be the aid program to be green. So this is one case to show that Chinese government, though initially they didn't have enough trust with the international actors, but since among ourselves we lack of expertise, we lack of indigenous knowledges, so we rather take a rather cooperative attitude to work closely with other actors, even from the international organization background. So WWF initiative is one case, and then now we say the second one was Global Witness. So this new guidelines released last month in October. Oh, sorry, yeah, October. And then this Global Witness, their own report actually is about how they use DRC Congolese case to show that some Chinese companies, they haven't really take seriously about this new guidelines. So their supply still have some problems. So in their report, they report heavily. So that's why I say the problem no, because they have been trying to be more independent, and then so I guess this is an independent report, although they delivered to me the Chinese version. So this is one question. The second one about Chinese soft power. Among Chinese scholars, people don't like soft power specifically, this term, because it rather means oppositely you also have hard power, which is different from Chinese agenda to be a peaceful country, to be a peaceful rising countries. So we rather emphasize harmonious. But although now our new president emphasizes Chinese dream. But then anyway, when you talking about human resource, this contribution, it has been there since the 1950s. And then I ever did research about how this policy has been evolved, and also what kind of a comprehensive and concrete impact or influence to the African development. In the first stage, we didn't see so much very positive things, except for there are lots of African students bring back Chinese wives. back to the specific countries, because the interesting thing is in the beginning of the 1980s, these African students, they receive the same stipend as high as a salary of university professors. So they can go to Beijing restaurant easily. So they have lots of teasers from Chinese ladies. So they got married with many Chinese ladies. And now when I visited the many African countries, especially like Tanzania, the largest numbers of students coming to China. So there you can see lots of this kind of mixed marriages. And currently, since 2006, the number of scholarship to African students increased greatly. Now the 3 years, because each 3 years we have one session of FOCAC meetings. So each 3 years numbers goes to 20,000. So, and then this is only from Chinese government, the Chinese Scholarship Council specifically. You also have other human resource training programs. Also each year is about 10,000. But I would rather see, in terms of effectiveness or aid effectiveness, I still see there are lots of gap to fill in. Chinese sometimes pay too much attention to face issues. So when they exaggerate the numbers, they somehow maybe didn't pay too much attention to the quality. So I think if they want to have a better soft power or human resource impact for Africans, they should somehow relate their business activity with all this aid program to make sure this aid program is really coming from the demand of African on the ground. And my third question is about my approach. Looks like defending Chinese. I actually started just saying I don't agree that China is only one actor to come to African continent. Although, yes, I do emphasize there is a great need for Chinese energy, for Africans' energy resource, which is one demand. But on the other hand, as the Charter shows us that Chinese investment so far goes to very diversified sectors, which means actors are diversified. So you have someone want to invest in manufacturers, someone want to invest in agriculture, which you can go easily see from the ground. So that's why I'm emphasizing there is not a probably there is one strategy from Chinese government about security of energy, but it's not the only driver. There are many different drivers, especially from the private sectors. They are going African themselves. Even before 2006, we didn't have enough initiative from Chinese government side. And also related to Professor Xiao's question about Chinese coming to Africa. That's also one of the answers to you. Yes, not only you or the French authors were talking about 1 million Chinese presenting in Africa. It's quite, even our Prime Minister, last time we traveled to Africa, he said we do have 1 million. So how to protect this large quantity of number of Chinese people is another challenge for Chinese government. And so these people actually really motivated by the so-called Chinese dream to get rich since 1980s. I just in the whole summer I was in Zimbabwe and then South Africa, just working with the Chinese community, trying to understand why. Because in South Africa now we are talking about 400,000. Although no one has accurate statistic, but you can actually you can add from one association, because there are associations rather based on provinces, original provinces. So you can add the numbers together, and then you can roughly get the number which people are discussing, about 400,000. So these people are driven really since the 1980s, the dream to be rich, to be fastly rich. So that's really among Chinese become such a popular thing. And then I was surprised in South Africa. I found that except for the previous batches of migrations coming to South Africa from Hong Kong, from other East Asian countries, the very new first batch coming from mainland, actually coming from Shanghai. You know Shanghai, a prominent economic center, and then why people coming from Shanghai need to migrate. And then I interviewed many people, the answer almost the same. During that moment, at the end of the 1980s, if you don't have any opportunity to travel abroad, you feel humiliated. That's kind of a very strong motivation driving Chinese people. Each one want to get rich quickly. So that's why I said China is not one specific body in the wholeness. There are so many different agenda, different actors. They are all pursuing their different agendas and initiatives. And then even for this minor resource issues, you will find company, they are not following the Chinese governmental agenda. They actually come to the continent, they can actually just buy the resource easily. It's safe. And it doesn't cost lots of energy to protect your own people, to protect your company. But when they started to indigenicize themselves, because they find opportunities. They find that in 50 or even 15 years' time, they don't have more opportunity elsewhere, even in China. So they needed some new economic field. So therefore, in Africa, we say this is an increasing number of Chinese in terms of not only freelance coming by individual, also based on the company's activities. Yes, I hope I answer all the questions. Oh, non-interference, yes. Actually, it's really, among Chinese scholars, there are so many debates about non-interference. Because according to realism, the power theories, once you get rich, once you get big, you need to be interfering as America. So there are one school, very strong from Tsinghua University, they really want Chinese government to change their non-interference policies. But on the other hand, the rather conservative school, which also shared by Chinese government, will never ever change this. But at the same time, you could also have kind of a creative environment. That's what the Chinese scholars are trying to help Chinese government to theorize, such as to say that this special envoy is one way to be creative, involved through international platforms or other platforms. I think yesterday we received the news that Chinese government has dispatched another 700 peacekeepers to South Sudan, and it was challenged a lot also by other critical point. And but Chinese government say we are not sending them to protect our oil field. Is supposed to only work as peacekeepers through UN system. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm afraid I'll have to give you both 2 minutes each as we wind off this session, please.
All right. So don't worry, I will be so brief, as I have to say no to both of the questions, and as Turkey is only a new player in Africa as opposed to other emerging powers, especially China, we can hardly talk about any Turkish investments in Eastern Africa, targeting specifically Eastern Africa, because Turkish government sees Northern Africa as separate, as a region where it had close cultural and historical ties dating back to the Ottoman era, and it sees sub-Saharan Africa as a separate region, but it sees it as a whole, not targets specific countries or specific regions as Eastern Africa. Although increasingly rising experts and senior officials say that Turkey's geographical proximity to Northern and Eastern Africa requires it to invest the energy sector in those countries, we cannot say that Turkey has a specific policy in any of the regions in Africa or to increase its investments in Eastern Africa at all. And it's for the question about the cooperation and coordination between Qatar and Turkey in terms of Africa, we can't say that there's any cooperation at all, because unfortunately the neglect and the lack of information on Africa in Turkish Foreign Ministry is also visible in terms of Qatar and in Gulf countries as well. So, and when you look at the date when the adoption to African policy, when African policy was adopted, it corresponds to an era when Turkey's application to European Union was rejected by the European Council. So Turkey would like to increase its alternatives, let's say, and would like to prove that it can be a regional or eventually a global power without the support of the Western countries. But it also would like to diversify its trade partners and its economic relations, as it's a country highly dependent on its energy imports, but we really cannot talk about any cooperation between Qatar and Turkey in terms of their relations in Africa and in terms of natural resource governance.
Thank you. So 2 minutes, so it will be really limited. I would like to make one specific point on Somalia. You asked why some companies can explore very risky regions such as Somalia. In fact, you have to understand that you had some exploration since many years in Somaliland and Puntland. You had also some drillings in Puntland onshore, even though it's one of the regions where most of the pirates are coming from. So you had some exploration way before Hassan Sheikh has been elected president of Somalia. But in the north, Somaliland and Puntland, you have autonomous government with Minister of Mines that are giving some blocks, and you have big companies that are investing since many years. And they are making some deals with different clans and the government to be sure that the exploration will not be in danger. And it has been quite okay in Puntland in 2011. No major problem, as long as you are really engaging the people on the ground. For Somalia itself, Mogadishu, you don't have any exploration right now. Shell, BP, Marathon have some blocks which are under force majeure, meaning that they have the blocks, but it's frozen since Siad Barre fall in 1991. And they are discussing with the government to know in which kind of conditions they can really work on the ground, but it's offshore. So up to now, you just have some dialogue between the government of Hassan Sheikh and the oil companies that are really interested by this specific region because of Yemen finds. So it's the same kind of geology. So it's one very interesting frontier. The other point I wanted to make is about the price of the barrels that is now $65 or $70. So since the beginning of the year, it has lost about $40. You can already see some projects that have been dropped, especially in Namibia, one project which is called Kudu, it's gas. The company decided not to go for it because it was not profitable. It was a very complex project, and it was complex as $100, so at 65 it's just not okay to move forward. The second project that had just been dropped last week is Banda. It's a project of gas in Mauritania. Same company, Tullow Oil, that decided not to go because it was not profitable anymore and they have to cut budget of exploration and development. And I'm sure you will have many other projects that are going to be dropped in the coming months if the price is still very, very little. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the round end of our discussion. I had two specific questions. Very briefly, Dr. George, ring fencing, corruption, does this translate to failure in governance? I wouldn't think so. Are we facing challenges? I think Uganda, yes, is facing challenges in government, in governance. Can something be done about it? I believe so. I think that there has been some attempt by government and other actors to deal with this issue. The extent to which we will succeed is a little bit problematic, but I think that, no, we have not failed. In answer to your question, Dr. Allen, if I may, the involvement of local actors in formulation of our laws, have we been involved? I think to some extent. Has it been enough? I don't think so. Could we have done better? I think we should have, but yes. In answer to your question, there has been an attempt by government to involve the local actors, not enough. But in all, I think the kind of regulatory framework in place on paper looks very good. Whether it will be implemented is another question. So with those, I want to thank in a very special way our brilliant presenters, and I'd like you to join me in moving a really big round of applause for them and to thank them. I think that this engagement should continue. We have emails for each other. I believe that the conference organizers will continue to allow us to engage even online and ensure that we understand better how and what it will require for us to attract the kind of investments that will enable us galvanize our extractive industry on the continent. And certainly there's a lot to learn from Qatar, and I hope that the continuous discussions that are going on will be able to enable us understand what seems and could work for the continent. Thank you very much.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بيتر كونز وهو محاضر حول الحوكمة بمركز دراسات الموارد الطبيعية، فليتفضل مشكورا وعنده 15 دقيقة. 15 minutes please, doctor.
Dear colleagues, does that not need to? Dear colleagues, my topic is good governance in extractive industries, and finally it's good governance and broad-based growth, including the question of transparency. I talk to you as somebody who has been working for 35 years in a development organization and has been involved the last 25 years with Transparency International. I'll structure my presentation in 4 parts. I'll talk first about why do we need this discussion about good governance. Secondly, why is transparency in this sector so important? Thirdly, I'll map some initiatives for transparency, and finally I'll finish with some remarks about where we stand with these initiatives. Dr. Bouzia has already talked about the global context, and Dr. Benjamin has talked about the growth and in oil and gas explorations in Africa. Extractive industries, as you know, is for many countries in the world the basis for economic development, and this is especially the case in the southern hemisphere. As we heard, on the African continent, many countries have started and increased the exploration of oil, gas, raw materials. However, in many cases, the majority of the population has not benefited. To the contrary, the gap between rich and poor has widened, and a decade of partly impressive growth in many countries with 2 digits already in some years has not brought comparable improvement in health, education, or in nutrition, for instance. There's no correlation between economic growth and the ranking, for instance, in the Human Development Report of UNDP. Under the 9 of the 12 last in the ranking are resource-rich countries, for instance, Chad, Niger, DRC, Mozambique, Mali, and without any chances in the last years. The new wealth for these countries, however, is a unique window of opportunity for a transformation of the economy. And in many cases, it's only a window of opportunity for, let's say, 20, 30 years before the depletion of mineral resources. It's a one-time chance. If the minerals are gone, they are gone. And therefore, the challenge is, on one hand, creating a broad-based growth based on the exploitation of these mineral resources, a growth that benefits not only a few, but the majority of the population. And secondly, we have mentioned it already, that might be the middle-term, long-term perspective, but a transformation for the economic base of a country in order to decrease the dependence on mineral resources and prepare for the post-mineral resource rich period of the development. The economic recipes are known: up and down linkages, horizontal linkages, corridor development, and others. I think what's important is, from a development point of view, to have a holistic approach according to the Conference on Sustainable Development. That means to have the triangle in mind. A triangle on one hand to preserve the environment, that's a long-term perspective. On the other hand, to create a conducive environment for the private sector. And finally, to have a stable political and social situation. That should be the guideline for policies in these countries. Transparency. Why is transparency so important? In general, it's a basic principle of good governance, but in the case of extractive industries, it's especially important. Why? Because of the complexity of the sector, the financial values involved, and the poor global post-colonial governance mechanisms and the imbalance of power between the different interest groups. There's a difference between this area of extractive industries and other areas. Transparency can benefit all stakeholders: the people, government, parliaments, political parties, civil societies, companies, shareholders, consumers. Governments benefit from following an internationally recognized transparency standard that demonstrates commitment to reform and anti-corruption, leading to improvement in tax collection and enhanced trust and stability in a volatile sector. And I want to mention again, especially the corruption issue which we just mentioned in connection with Uganda. For the companies, transparency is important because it creates a level playing field in which all companies are required to live up to the same high standards of corporate social responsibility. Also this, of course, helps to prevent corruption. If everybody knows that it's the same transparency standards for everybody. And as far as citizens and civil society is concerned, and parliament, media, they all benefit from receiving the reliable information about the sector, where they can better hold government and companies to account. This increased stability then encourages also long-term investments in production and thus improves the reliability of supply. So, in the end, it's all stakeholders would benefit if there is a transparent level playing field for everybody. In the last years, some initiatives have developed, and I would like to map them very quickly. The first one was the National Resource Charter. It's an initiative by the Oxford University. Experts and practitioners around Paul Collier have developed it. It's a charter with 12 precepts following the Resource Charter value chain, excellent piece of work, but of course it's only a university or expert product. It gives advice to countries, but has no political power by itself. The second one is the African mining vision. I don't want to go into details. It's an innovative, holistic vision for the government of the mineral sectors in Africa. It's new. 2009 was the decision. 2013 only was a center created. And first of all, it's only a vision. So it's really, and it's a political will on the African regional level. Is there the political will on the national level? And what does it mean to put a vision into practical measures on the ground? So there's still a lot to do. These are the two visions. The second is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. It emerged out of an initiative by a number of civil society organizations, Global Witness, Transparency, Oxfam, who joined in a coalition to ask extractive industry companies to publish what they pay in taxes, royalties, dividends, bonuses, and so on, and to the host countries where they operate. Today, the EITI is a global standard with a flexible methodology for monitoring and reconciling company payments and government revenues on the other side. Each implementing country creates its own EITI process, which is overseen by participants, and that's the important element, by participants from government, from the civil society, and by the private sector. So the idea is not government coming up with regulations, but all players, all stakeholders sit together, make a realistic analysis of the situation, and come to an action plan what has to be done in this country. 29 countries are compliant, that they fulfill the standards. 17 are on the way to, are candidates on the way to be compliant. And now, in a new development, Germany, France, Italy, UK are also preparing to become member of EITI. They used to be observers only, but now they apply for being real members of the system. What's new? It's a multi-stakeholder approach, certain procedures, certain standards, and also a multi-stakeholder and a small secretariat in Oslo, which sets the standards and audits the reports. Another area are the mandatory reporting requirements. You have all heard about it, the Dodd-Frank Act, which asked all companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange to report their payments in publicly accessible yearly reports. The same regulations are now introduced in the EU member states after a decision of the EU, and all the member states have time till the end of 2015 to put these regulations in practice. Then there are other initiatives like, of course, everything which has to do with anti-corruption. There is the United Nations conventions, there is the AU conventions, and there are also things like the Revenue Watch Index, which are important in this area. So, where do we stand? These initiatives started only recently. You heard from Dr. Buzia, 2009 was the decision, 2013 the center established. EITI started 2005, I think. It's still the first 39 countries are already reporting, but still we are in the beginning. And Dodd-Frank Act and the European regulations are new. So it's early to say what they bring, but we are already in a situation where the discussion on on what we can do for transparency in the extractive industry has really started. My second point, it's important, yes, that's important. The second point is we concentrated very much now on transparency on the national level, especially EITI. What's also important is transparency on a local level, there where the mines really work, and they have their connections with the district, the communities, and so on, and very often also legal obligation to support this. There's no transparency on that level yet, so that's important. My third point then is the BRICS states are not member of any initiative. I know that in the case of South Africa, several missions of EITI went to Pretoria, to Joburg, to convince the government without success. So that means, to a certain extent, the money is still going to Swiss bank accounts, corruption to a high degree, and some of the major players in Africa are not part of the efforts to do something against it. And I think this is politically really a problem which is, from my view, not acceptable. My fifth point is, at the end, very much depends on African governments. The question is there the political will? If there is not the political will and not the understanding that the benefits from the richness of a country has to go to the majority of the people. If people still look for their own pockets and want to use it for the enrichment of a few of the elites, then all the efforts cannot succeed. So finally, the question is political will on the national level. Thank you.
شكرا الدكتور بيتر على الالتزام بالوقت تماما، وأعتقد أننا استمعنا إلى مداخلة جيدة جدا حول الحوكمة الرشيدة في مجال الصناعات الاستخراجية وما يتعلق بالشفافية التي هي مهمة جدا بالنسبة لجميع القطاعات وأحرى قطاع الصناعات الاستخراجية. مباشرة سأذهب إلى المتحدث الثالث والذي هو فانتو شيرو، وسيحدثنا عن الحكم الرشيد والشفافية في الصناعات الاستخراجية بإفريقيا. طبعا كما قلت في البداية، فانتو شيرو باحث مشارك في مركز دراسات الإفريقية بليدن بجامعة ليدن بهولندا، وفي نفس الوقت أستاذ زائر بجامعة واشنطن دي سي. تفضل دكتور فانتو.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief. I'll structure my presentation in four ways. First, I would like to get into the state of play in the BRICS-Africa relations, talking about vectors of interaction. Second, I'll try to explore what are the elements of Qatar's soft power. Third, I'll try to talk about the Africa's strategic priorities in the context of structural transformation. And finally, I'll try to conclude by asking the question, how can we align Qatar's soft power with Africa's priority? How can we align Qatar 2030 with the Africa Union Agenda 2063? So we will look into, I think one of the key elements that we've learned over the last few years is that the commodity super cycle have certainly benefited African countries, most of it driven by the demand from the emerging economies. On the other hand, the continent has not been able to achieve broad-based development and structural transformation. This is certainly due to a number of factors, first being limited institutional and legal capacity to develop and manage natural resources. In fact, for that matter, a lack of long-term strategic vision where Africa wants to travel over the next 50 years. Part of it is really that visions issues of leadership. Second, they have to do with poor capacity to create linkages between the mineral sector and other sectors of the economy. And finally, poor state capacity again in contract negotiation, collect and invest revenues wisely in a sustainable way, that would lead toward structural transformation. So the aim of my talk is really to sort of examine the extent to which Qatar can strategically deploy its soft power to enable African countries to fully develop their extractive sector, embark, of course, on the process of industrialization, a matter I will come in a minute. But this has been really an interesting decade for Africa. It's been a decade of partnership. Everybody wants to partner with Africa. Everybody loves us more than we love ourselves. So you got all sorts of partnerships emerging from the formal dialogue forums such as with FOCAC, with ISAF with India, the Korea-Turkey summit, and then there are inter-regional forums with no formal dialogue platform such as the Africa-South America, Afro-Arab, Iran-Africa summit, and so there is also private sector-driven dialogue forums in Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, Canada, Norway, France, Israel, and the list goes on. So this has become a proliferation of partnership across the board. But what are the key vectors of interaction between Africa and the emerging economies in particular? The key vectors of interaction certainly are trade, aid, and investment. But if you look particularly with the emerging economy, both in each of these categories, in aid, trade, and investment, they are very much oriented toward the natural resource sector. In the trade sector, certainly trade has grown up over the last decades in a phenomenal way. It's not only China as the main player, there are a number of other countries, South Korea, Brazil, Turkey, you name it, which have become important players in the trade sector. An important note to take here is much of this growing trade between Africa and the emerging economies is heavily concentrated in half a dozen African countries. And the composition of that trade is basically, as you look here, mostly in minerals and crude material sector. So the emerging economy is heavily concentrated in half a dozen African countries that export minerals and petroleum. These products account between about 69 to 90% of total export, a pattern very similar to Africa's trade with the traditional partners. So again, if you look into China, where is it much of so-called China invading Africa? This is basically focused around petroleum exporting countries. These are the major trading partners with China. And the same thing you can say in terms of the investment dimension, on which I'll come back. Also, FDI inflows continues to be unevenly distributed to a large share going to a limited number of oil exporting African countries. Here again, if you look into the flows to countries exporting to oil, which is in red, and the flow going to the countries that are not exporting oil. So in a sense, in 2011, for example, 15 oil exporting African countries received 75% of FDI flows from emerging countries. So it's heavily concentrated in those countries. So the figures basically tell us it's again resource-oriented areas. The sectoral distribution of mergers and acquisitions also. If you look into what mergers and acquisitions by emerging economies, companies, state-owned companies, private companies, basically 25% into mining sector, 32% going to finance, often linked to mining and infrastructure. So again, the resource seeking has been the principal motivation by investors from emerging economies. The aid sector, even if you go into what we call aid, I mean, it's not really doesn't fall under the traditional aid or technical assistance. Here again, also, the red indicating in FDI or ODA flowing to Africa. Again, much of it has been the composition of aid, the model of the delivery is different from one practiced by the traditional Western donors. Well, the point I'm trying to make here is that what is clear, looking into aid, trade, and investment, unlike the traditional donors, emerging partners from the South exercise a much closer strategic integration of aid, trade, and investment. So despite the rhetoric of non-interference and no conditionality, these new partners actually impose non-policy conditions, such as access to natural resources or the purchase of goods and services in exchange for money and investment promised at the beginning of summit. So investment policies are, these aid policies, investment policies, and trade policies are the glue that keep and sustain the kind of asymmetrical relationship between Africa and the emerging economies. So transforming this relationship is very important than writing laws and legislation about natural resource governance. We need to understand the mechanisms, how these bundled forms of investment take into a point. So that's just the overall. Let me come back with regard to Qatar in terms of soft power. I know nothing about Qatar except what I read. I've never been to this part of the world, but it was a subject I was given to speculate. What are the soft power, according to Joseph Nye, is the ability to affect and obtain outcomes that one wants through attraction rather than coercion of payment. So what would constitute Qatar's soft power? What are the attributes? One, of course, is political stability in a volatile region by virtue of its strategic and military relationship with the United States. It's considered a stable place by virtue you have the American umbrella, military umbrella protecting it. So there's a great deal of stability in a volatile region. Second, similar to Norway, I would say, Qatar is a model country in terms of responsible management of natural resources for development and to create a more diversified economy. And I think this diversification agenda is part of the Qatar 2030 agenda, more diversification. The third element is an effective income distribution policy, which is basically an important attraction. The fourth element has to do with liberal and tolerant social cultural environment. In an environment where we live in this part of the world, we feel much more easier to come in here than I would go to Saudi Arabia, for example. A generous aid policy, and a huge financial reserves. It can deploy to establish alternative development financing mechanism that other countries can rely on. Take again the Qatar Investment Agency, who's about what, $265 billion reserves or more. So there is that power. And certainly you cannot compare it to your neighbors across, to the UAE. UAE over the last 5 years invested some $19 billion in Africa over across 17 infrastructure projects. So there is a lot of resources to be used. And finally is really first-rate universities you have created here too. That can serve as a platform for research and knowledge exchange in the field of extractive development and the management of resources. So I think there's an opportunity, particularly for this university. I challenge this university to sort of create a center for that kind of research where there should be knowledge exchange among Africa. So of these 7 attractions that I mentioned, probably the 2 are critically important for establishing a kind of win-win partnership between Qatar and African countries. One, of course, is the attraction of the successful development experience in translating natural resources to our development. The second is, again, Qatar's immense financial resources, sovereign wealth fund. This is a strategic resource that can be deployed. Having said that, how can Qatar's soft power be aligned to African priority is an important question, because Africa today is completely different from Africa of 10 years ago. We are much more confident. We know certain things that we want to do. So there are Africa's priorities, particularly the AU Agenda 63, the Common Africa Position on Post-2015 Agenda. So a major issue facing African countries is that of sustainability and structural transformation. This is the language of the day. How to move away from reliance on natural resources, export, and diversify the economy, and thereby reduce economic vulnerabilities. How to sustain growth and widen the distribution of benefit of growth to larger population. How to improve productivity, especially in agriculture, and reduce unemployment. How to improve competitiveness of local industry, and thereby enhance external financial inflows. These questions are very much captured by the African by this agenda. So we have a number of issues here. That means that partnership have to be consistent with African agendas. Let me quickly turn in to look into in the question of governance. I think on one hand we have too much governance. There is a significant domestic, regional, transnational initiative, as you have mentioned, Kimberley process, EITI, all this issue. On the other hand, we are confronted with too little governance. What do I mean by too little governance? Many African countries still suffer from capacity gaps, from the knowledge gap, from information gap, technical infrastructural gap, accountability mechanisms, participatory mechanisms, legal capacity issues. So on one hand, there are international experiences. On the other hand, our ability to do so becomes very difficult. But what would be Qatar's contribution in terms of this whole partnership will be breaking the BRICS financial stranglehold. Why do we do a lot of business with the BRICS countries? Part of it has to do with financing. You know, they come in with finance up in front. So because we don't have an alternative financing mechanism, so we give in to demands coming from the BRIC country because finance. So can Qatar become an important player in breaking the BRICS financial stranglehold, giving us an alternative financing platform for infrastructure, etc., etc. So secondly, is the need to strengthen the state capacity in strategic planning for benefication, for diversification, for industrialization. These are critical areas of the partnership have to do. Thirdly, how to improve the quality of resource potential data. We don't know. We don't have any capacity, geological data or anything, how much we have underground. So how do we improve that? Which is also an important element in the African mining vision. How to develop bargaining capacity, how to develop transparency, system of awarding contract, strengthening systems and institutions. But I must say, whatever principle, whatever partnership we go, it has to be guided by fundamental principles, that partnership. What does that partnership principle should be? One, the partnership have to be compatible with African aspirations. Past experience has shown the development process cannot be sustainable if the partnership does not allow ample scope for African initiatives and aspirations. The time for imposing is gone. We refuse to be imposed upon. So we need to sort of dialogue so that have compatibility with African interests. Secondly, transparency of interest. Let's put our interest on the table. Let's be clear from the beginning. Being explicit from the beginning, partners will be able to find middle ground without jeopardizing the relationship. Third, alignment of expectations. We tend to have, the expectations have to be aligned both on Qatar side as well as on the African side. So capabilities from both sides would be very critical. Finally, partnerships have to be result orientation. Partnerships are not set in a vacuum. They must lead to tangible results or deliverables that validate the contribution of the partnership. So with this point, I think the key critical areas of work I would see is the financing part is going to be very important. Establishing alternative financing platform is going to be important. Capacity and value addition is going to be an important area. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور فرانك توشيرو. أعتقد أننا استمعنا إلى مداخلة رائعة جدا حول دور القوى الناعمة في قطر ودور دول البريكس وعلاقتها بإفريقيا وما يتعلق بالحوكمة. اكتفي فقط بأن أشير إلى الجملة الجميلة التي وردت على لسانكم، وهي أن إفريقيا اليوم أصبحت أكثر ثقة بنفسها وأصبحت مؤهلة للشراكات وأحرار مع الشراكة مع دولة قطر. فمباشرة لا أريد أن أطلع عليكم، سأعطي 15 دقيقة للنقاش لأن ما زالت عندنا جلسة نهائية حتى لا نتعب كثيرا. إذا الآن القاعة هي اللي عندها.
Can you talk more about the bargaining capacity? Because you are the first one who brought this word, the bargaining capacity here. I mean, particularly it's very important when you bring like the other resources or the investment into the other countries or even within their own countries, because when a labor or the society has a more bargaining power within the state, then like there will be a more equity and justice in there. And like this one of the very key element in the ILO labor standards, if you look into it, and like the bargaining power. So how do you think like when you have this, the foreign cross investment, cross-border investment, or within the investment, how you can build that bargaining power within the community, within the citizens itself, that can like kind of like, improve the equality and like, and reduce corruption. That's what my understanding of the Norwegian system is, that like they have a huge bargaining power, like even with the natural resources or with the non-natural resources. Thank you.
شكرا. أرجو من المتدخل أن يعرفنا بنفسه ويحدد أي الأستاذين، هل بيتر أو فانتو.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My first question is to Dr. Fanta Cherry. That was a very great analytical presentation. Thank you very much. My question to you is regards to that last slide that you have, breaking the BRICS financial stranglehold on Africa. I'm trying to understand and you actually have it in quotes, stranglehold. So I'm trying to have a better understanding of that term, because at the end of the day, it's because of the BRICS countries that Africa's economy actually grew so large the past decade. It's because China went in and began investing. It's because South Africa also has been investing a high FDI on the economy. It's because Brazil was busy in Angola and all places. So I'm just saying, could you explain more on what if there are negative strangleholds? Maybe we need to understand or gain, also to make sure that when new countries come in, whether it's Qatar or another country, things that we need to learn out of what has been happening with the previous break-in. If you can just expand on that stranglehold. And to the gentleman who presented on the EITI, I understand about the issue of transparency and what has happened. I'm still trying to get a grasp of and I agree transparency is very, very important. I mean, from a South Africa perspective with auditing, without that you won't know what is happening. So I would like to know the impact that out of that, especially like if you now go back to the issue of the BRICS stranglehold and the way some countries do business in Africa. Has there been any negative or positive impact? Because you raised the fact that BRICS countries have not signed this thing. So has there been any impact due to their lack of signing? And do you think it will make a difference? If so, how? In a country like South Africa, where we already have measures in place for transparency initiatives. Thanks.
Thank you very much. With regard to bargaining capacity, when I look into having served as advisor to government in terms of the composition, it's not only just minerals, it could be trade or others. We don't have subject matter specialists, it's bureaucrats who are negotiating. If you go into other countries' negotiation, you got lawyers, you got financiers drawn from that sector. So even though you have government that's leading a delegation, you need to have the people who have the substantive knowledge, who understand the legal part, the financial part. So our ability to bargain from a position of weaknesses, because we haven't done our homework right, we don't invest on research, analytical work, and I have made so many delegations, where we come completely unprepared to do so. So we undercut ourselves and we undercut the whole country. So I think we need to give more due in terms of particularly these complex areas such as oil and mining. That's a very complex area, but you need the right people, the right expertise, or you need to invest on those expertise. That way when you sit down across the table, bargaining means give and take, and you come out with a deal that you feel satisfied. So we tend to sort of undercut ourselves by an ability not to do our homework ahead of time, not to put the right people on the right place. So it came out at the end of the day simply. And secondly, along the negotiation, of course, really, some of these deals really, takes place at the State House, where deals are made, royalties are paid, Parliament is not even, have no right, not consulted, as weak Parliament is, it has to hold the executive responsible, so scrutinizing. So we have, those are the kind of things why others can take advantage of us because of our own foolishness. So it's possible to negotiate from a position of strength, but you need to do your homework right. And on the financing part, certainly I think the BRIC countries, their engagement to Africa has done marvels, but we could have done more. But the problem is the financing part is difficult. Nobody else steps in to finance an infrastructure project, but they come in. So when they do that, which is great, I mean, you take it as it is, but you could have done more. If you have an alternative financing platform, then you'll be asking a number of other issues on beneficiation and a whole set of issues you can do. So they have become kind of, financiers of the last resort. So we give in whatever they ask because nobody comes in to do so. And we have a situation right now where I'm a little bit slightly involved in my own country, in Ethiopia, with a telephone, the telecommunication sector. Nobody can finance that except ZET, the Chinese company. So Ericsson, which was the first company to come in, which has to leave the country, now may be given the opportunity to come in, not because ZET is not delivering, but Ericsson learned the lesson. They managed to bundle together financing so that they can finally break in the monopoly of ZET in Ethiopia. So having an alternative financing platform gives us even more room to maneuver and to ask the right question in the future.
Thank you very much. Dr. Petera, if you have...
Come back to the extractive industries initiative and your question. The basic idea is that, that comes from the campaign Publish What You Pay, that the companies publish what they pay, everything. That means taxes, royalties, whatever companies have to pay. On the other hand, the governments publish what they receive, and that project by project. And the idea is that you would see if there's a gap. And then you have this multi-stakeholder group with the private sector, government, especially with NGOs, which would like to ask what happened, and then at the end there has to be a report reconciled by everybody with all the problems or the gaps hopefully solved. And this is a way to make sure that all money which belongs to a government and finally can be used for development really goes where it has to go. So the problem is, if there are hopefully all investors in a country would follow these rules. But if there are major players which are not part of the game, that's of course a problem.
Thank you very much. I would just like to add to what the last speaker said in relation to her question. My country is an EIT implementing country, and I'd like to share with you some of the benefits of what the country has experienced. One, apart from the disclosures, it has informed policy reforms in our fiscal regimes because it brought to the fore gaps that we overlooked in our fiscal regime. So after we produced 3-4 reports, these gaps were glaring, so we had to address them. Two, it also helped us to strengthen our public financial management systems in the country. The issue is, it's not a tick box exercise. You have to do it to suit your country situation, to address the key issues in your country. And as you implement them, these issues will come up for you to address. Three, before the implementation of EITI, in many African countries, there were agitation between civil society groups, community groups, and companies. It was all over. Ghana, Tanzania, Mali, Guinea, mention them. The EITI provided a key platform for engagement. So these tensions actually reduced considerably in countries that are implementing EITI. There were quite a number, but I think I'll just leave it here for now.
1 minute.
Thank you, gentlemen. Very good presentations. I'm Jason from UMass Boston, and my question can be answered by either of you or both. With the proliferation of transparency initiatives, the African Mining Vision, the EITI, Publish What You Pay, do they complement one another? They're all relatively different, and they offer something different. But do they complement one another, or might they interfere with one another?
Peter, your last comment.
EITI should be the instrument to bring them all together on a national level. There is a danger, which you mentioned, but since EITI looks as a whole country, looks as all initiative, and looks as where do we stand in a country and what can we do, if they're overlapping or problems like you mentioned, they should be solved through this stakeholder dialogue.
Thank you. Okay, your last one, please.
I think the individual country situation, one has sort of really keep ear on the ground to see what are the contradictions in the national context, to make sure. Sometimes you can use them as an opportunity to drive the reform agenda further. In some areas, you may have to sort of take a pause and find out when would be the right time to press that button. But the context will be different. In some areas, it's just so an opportunity, it opened up a debate, and that will actually lead to expansion of the reform agenda. In other areas, it might step into sensitive issues that has to do with broader governance issue, broader regional issues. So one has to kind of understand the local context and see how far one can push, and then when to seize the moment also when that opening comes in, how that can provide opportunity. For me, I think the most important area is really how to give a new lease in life to our dead legislation system. We need some kind of accountability. Parliament have to scrutinize certain things. These are of importance of national nature, that there have to be a mechanism through the legislative system. Even just holding a hearing, it may not produce anything itself as an important measure. But again, it all depends on the nature of the social forces in each country. Some places where you really gain tremendous gains, in other areas would be. But there are areas of contradiction one have to look into.
Thank you, our professors. Thank you for all. We close this session.
Okay, we have 1 hour for 3 papers and discussion. Otherwise you miss the bus. And we'll have to walk that huge distance back to the residence and work up your appetite for dinner. It seemed inappropriate for me to both chair and come first, so Brian is going to kick off, and then we'll have Alan, and if there's time, me, and discussion, and Bas. So I don't think either Brian or Alan need any further introduction, so welcome and take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Tim, and no pressure, of course, just the prospect of missing the bus. So I have a few slides to show you on the topic that we've been discussing today. My title isn't quite what you saw in the agenda, so excuse me, but this is what, over the weekend, it seemed to me that this might be the best thing to share with you. So this whole idea of getting the most out of extractives in Africa is the theme that I think runs through all our deliberations today. And what I'm going to suggest is that we're basically trying to tackle 2 problems. One is dealing with market failure, and the other one is dealing with governance failure. And there's some indications of a way forward on this, and the World Bank likes to believe it has a role to play in the way forward. So my slides basically, first of all, confirm what we know about non-renewable resource abundance on the continent. A little bit of a framing for you of what the opportunities and risks are. Then what I mean by market failure and governance failure, some ways forward in the role of the World Bank. Now I do have a number of, I tried to play around with my slides so that there are some words as well as maps, and so if lights could be reduced a little bit, it would help. I don't know if somebody's got their finger on the switch. But anyway, just in a few words, you know, if we think about Africa and the rest of the world in terms of non-renewable resources, there is this focus on Africa now. I mean, the abundance is both in terms of known resources and also potential resources, because it's not as if Africa is new to natural resources. There are abundant known but stranded resources. That's to say, they exist but they haven't been able to be commercialized, in some cases for over 100 years. At the same time, there are very high returns to an intensified exploration. Some of you will be familiar with Sir Paul Collier's refrain that roughly the level of intensity of exploration in Africa is just 1/5 of that of the average of the world. So there's no reason to believe that Africa is less endowed. So if you could multiply the effort by 5, then ipso facto you have a lot more resources than we even know now. But of course the important story in the last 10 to 15 years, as well as the, let's say, exogenous factors like a strong minerals demand and prices, is the gradual resolution of a number of non-geological risks that had previously hindered investment in Africa. Whereas for the rest of the world, gradually the trends show that there are reduced returns on exploration, both in terms of quantity of minerals that can be found and the quality of those minerals. And there's some very excellent data to show how grades, for example, of copper deposits on the whole are trending down. For oil exploration, that for every dollar spent, you find less oil in the rest of the world. And so it's natural that companies, investors and resource-hungry countries should be looking to where the returns are the best. The other thing, inhibitor in the rest of the world, particularly in OECD countries, is various new environmental and social risks or barriers to investment. The map there is simply one, a slightly old map, because I see Mozambique doesn't look to have many minerals, whereas of course it has very rich coal deposits. But it's just an illustration that mineral deposits are all over the continent. So how would there are clearly opportunities and risks associated then with this resource abundance. First of all, there's the point repeated several times today that these resources dominate the current asset base in Africa, even though thus far they're underexploited. By asset base, I mean compared with the other kinds of both physical and human assets and reproducible assets on which a diversified economy depends. Extractive industries entail high risks and high rewards for economic development. On the risk side, we know about the negative narrative around the resource curse ever since Sachs and Warner undertook their analysis correlating resource abundance with poor economic performance. But on the positive side, we now have a narrative that talks about resource-driven development. So whether it's McKinsey's report last year called Reverse the Curse, or OECD's special theme in 2013 on structural transformation around extractives, or indeed, as we heard from Kojo Busia just now on the Africa Mining Vision, there is a more positive narrative. At the end of the day, extractive industries are associated with two ingredients of successful economic development. Extractive industries are associated with risk-taking FDI, and it's also associated with the mobilization of rents, in this case resource rents, that can be captured by the state to be converted into other forms of assets. But in relation to each of those are also risks, so that, for example, market failure in the form of FDI that is enclave in nature, not developmental. Again, we heard that the Africa Mining Vision is trying to break away from that. And of course, the governance failures that arise in the form of rent seeking. So you see the sense of opportunity and risk. What are the market failures? Now, first of all, I'm not sure if you can see everything. Well, hopefully you can see what I've written. I don't want to, because of the limitation of time, we have a number of gaps. We have an infrastructure gap. We have a local supply chain gap, that is the ability to supply goods and services into these extractive industries. An acute skills gap. In fact, the World Economic Forum survey on the global agenda for 2015 has found that it is the skills gap that is Africa's #1 challenge. There's a local processing gap, the fact that if materials are being exported in their raw form, the solutions to that would require solving the problems of the preceding three gaps: the infrastructure gap, the local supply chain gap, and the skills gap. All need to be solved in order to provide a foundation for local processing. And finally, there's the development finance gap, in which public sector finance is scarce and private sector funding is risk averse. PPPs still account for a tiny share of the financing market, and I think we have some expertise here so we can reflect on that point. And then there's the well-known point of capital flight highlighted in the Africa Progress Panel report under Kofi Annan. So it's a powerful and unfortunate cocktail of gaps, which I've characterized as market failure. And sorry, I forgot the bit that I spent over an hour trying to work on. So the first map there shows persons per square kilometer. So it's a population density map. And hold that in your minds. That's the primary road network. And if you look just to the north and to the northeast, you'll see that Southern Europe and the Middle East has much higher road density. And this one I like. Those are the nights at light. Sorry, the lights at night. Always happens. So, yeah. You can see the story. Governance failure, then, well, I mentioned rent seeking, and the rent seeking, of course, is you know, it's not inevitable, of course, but it can and does happen all the way along the value chain, whether we're talking about licensing, that's the award of mineral and petroleum rights, whether it's in the taxing of the sector, or whether it's in the spending of the money that's generated by the sector. So there's rent seeking associated with closed governance systems and weak policy and regulatory institutions. And of course these things are monitored. So whether we use the Mo Ibrahim Index, so the map at the top where red is not very good and green is much better, is a sort of a map that was created on the basis of the Mo Ibrahim Index, I think in 2010, possibly 2011. The table below that comes from the worldwide governance indicators, which the World Bank Group is partly is involved in, together with others. And well, that you might not be able to tell from the bars, and I don't have a pointer, but basically it's comparison on 1, 2, 3, 4, on 6 different measures, governance ratings between East Asia, which is above, and Sub-Saharan Africa below. And in each case, you can see the bar above is higher than the one below, signifying the gap there between governance indicators in East Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the NRGI's Resource Governance Index, which I didn't have space on the slide to show it, and it's a bit difficult to read, but that is the index that is most closely tailored to evaluating governance risks in the extractive sector, and it was mentioned earlier on today, and should be an important source. So just a couple more slides. What are the ways forward? In terms of market failure, then what is emerging is a body of thinking and action around shared value. Namely that there are opportunities being missed where private sector and public sector can realize greater benefits by working together than alone. And examples of that, for example, in the area of infrastructure, would be in the harnessing of gas, which may very often is produced by private sector, to power, which is a sector that's often, if not owned by the public sector, is very much dependent on tariff setting by the state. And so gas to power in Africa is becoming an ever more important storyline. It's unfortunate to hear that a week ago the Banda gas project in Mauritania, which was to have supplied gas for power generation both in Mauritania and then subsequent supply of electricity to Senegal, that project is now in serious doubt. But that was an example of a project that would yield much broader dividends than just a gas project. Resource transport corridors, we heard about the north-south corridor earlier today. In fact, under NEPAD, there are some 12 or so transport corridors that are very closely correlated with the resource base, whether it's minerals or hydrocarbons. And so that requires coordinated efforts on the part of the private sector and the public sector. The opportunities for mining projects themselves that can be quite hungry for power, to be an anchor off-taker for power generation and help extend national power grids. This is something on which the World Bank has done a study last year called The Power of the Mine, which, if you're interested in, I'll provide references to. So in the infrastructure space, there are opportunities to sort of bring together align different interests in the in both private sector and the public sector to yield greater public good overall. In the local content area, getting partnerships between the private and the public sector around local procurement strategies of the industry, and having enabling policies developed by the host governments can potentially yield significant benefits in terms of local content. Public-private partnerships around skilling of Africa is something that certainly in the World Bank we're very interested in, both in terms of tertiary specializations and in the area of training, technical and vocational education and training. And there's some work that we're doing at the moment looking at best practices around private sector support for TVET in the extractive industries. Integrated local development, building corporate social investment into local government programs. Everyone will be familiar with how important corporate social responsibility is as a way of earning a social license to operate. The narrative among major extractive corporations now is corporate social investment, getting away from the idea of charity towards something more tangible. And what's very important is that what they invest is tied in with the local development programs of the subnational governments. And there's a lot that the World Bank is doing in that space, coupled with the need for community development agreements. So just as companies and governments are negotiating the basic terms under which investment take place, so too must the communities be drawn in, and there's a growing body of experience and lessons around community development agreements, from which some of the more tangible benefits of mining and oil and gas development can result. And in relation to financing gap, development financing gap, then there are non-traditional forms. We've heard today about sovereign wealth funds. I think we heard about something of the order of $2 trillion in Gulf state sovereign wealth funds. So there are opportunities for co-investment by sovereign wealth funds in, for example, the Gulf region, and some of the new sovereign wealth funds within Africa themselves. So co-investment in high priority, high return infrastructure projects, for example. And then we also heard earlier about resource financed infrastructure, or what used to be called the so-called Angola model, in which basically the future revenues from minerals and oil are, if you like, pledged in advance towards the building of infrastructure. And this is a model that not only China has used, but also Korea, and some others are looking very closely at it. It comes with its advantages and disadvantages. There is a publication I was involved in about the use of RFI. If people are interested, I can refer them to it. So that's on the market failure side of the ledger. If we look at good governance, I think we've heard about the disclosure initiatives already. I think we've heard a little bit about the role of parliaments. I'd like to emphasize the role of supreme audit institutions as well. And there's actually an interesting initiative by the International Association of Supreme Audit Institutions, INTOSAI, to set up a working group on extractive industries. They're showing very great interest in being able to exercise their constitutional functions, which allow them to ask tough questions of the executive arm of government, but in the area of extractives. And of course, we've heard about multi-stakeholder groups, the MSGs, who can be an important instrument as exemplified by EITI. We cannot forget that ultimately we need capable policy and regulatory institutions, and that is a slow and hard business which the World Bank is well versed in supporting, whether through supporting the development of strong sector management or strong revenue management. But of course, all of this, these vectors, if you like, in good governance depend very much in a form of governance that is more democratized and more consultative in nature. Finally then, this is something you can read this evening under candlelight. If you're really interested in the role of the World Bank Group, I'm obliged to always have a slide about our role. But just as a reminder, our role straddles bank lending and guarantees to the public sector, a lot of bank analytics. There's the role of IFC, our private sector funding arm, and MEGA that provides political risk guarantees. And if you can get them all working together, it becomes quite a potent force. So that's my last point. And thank you very much.
It's interesting how the room is so empty. It means there'll be fewer questions. Thank you so much. I've been asking myself that if we discuss these topics and say 30 years back, would they have been valid? All the topics we discuss here today about Africa, if we discuss them 30 years back, would they have been valid? I don't know what the answer is. I'll leave that to all of us. I noticed that in the past 2 decades, many African countries have exhibited increased signs of field accountability in the nations. And I asked myself, how did we get here? How did we get here? I would like us to look at some historical trends in the extractive sector as far as Africa is concerned. It's unfortunate the gentleman from Al Jazeera is not here, but I'd like to refer to Africa, not because it's one state, but because many of the issues in each of the countries are very similar, and that is why we keep referring to Africa. In the period up to the 1980s, African countries were engaged in the extractive sector. Just as one speaker said earlier on, in the oil sector, there were only few, very limited players on the field. In Nigeria, Gabon, and I think Egypt. In the mining sector, they were purely owned and controlled, operated by most nation states. And so the question about transparency, accountability, royalties, bonuses, bonuses, whether the state is using the funds the way it should, I doubt whether those questions would have been valid then. Then came the period of the 80s, where our big brother introduced the structural adjustment programs, the liberalization of the mining sector, of the extractives, where African governments were asked to open up the sector and invite foreign investors. The era of attracting foreign direct investment, where African governments had to lower the bar, whether fiscal regime, regulatory regime, whatever it was, just to attract foreign direct investment in the sector. In the end, what happened? The state lost control. It was confused as to its role in the sector. But the too many players who came in, the too many players who came into the continent from different countries, many of them we could not regulate because their wealth was far more than the whole country's GDP. And it happened in my country. It happened in my country, not once, not twice. It happened in Mali, it happened in Guinea, many other countries. So the state was confused about what its primary role was. What is worrying is when the state uses public funds to gamble in exploitation projects that they have very limited skills for. It is the case with GNPC, the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation. It is the case in many other countries. I must say kudos to Tanzanians, though, in recent times, as I was discussing with Brian, in recent times, I mean just about a week or two ago, where the Tanzanian parliament brought an issue up about corruption, about how state funds was being used. And I understand that they've been thrown into jail. I would wish that African parliaments would be this strong. The reason why this issue has become a topic for us to discuss is because in most African democratic states, the parliaments are there just to rubber stamp what the executive will do. And so real oversight is basically absent. Civil society and media who have critical role in playing public oversight, many at times do not have that capacity. because these are non-romantic areas, these are technical areas, and these are, I mean, the areas that they do not attract much attention. And so in the end, we have the media not engaging. We have civil society not engaging as much as we'd want them to. I'll give an example. In Ghana, when we get our oil funds, we have the Petroleum Revenue Management Law, which clearly defines how the resources should be used. Now, this is how it works. When all the oil revenues are gotten, 30% is given to the National Oil Company, who have over and over and over again exhibited that they don't have absorption capacity, yet we keep pushing money there. How are these resources being used? So there hasn't been a single report as to how these resources are being used. Now that money is given to them even before the rest is shared into the budget and into the petroleum holding funds. So the question is, are we getting it right? The question I keep asking is, are we getting it right? From the policy level, from the regulatory level, are we getting it right? That's a question I'd like to leave with all of us. We tried to, well, I would say civil society pushed an agenda in that same bill where the Public Interest and Accountability Committee was created to more or less provide that public oversight, to control how public use funds, because once the funds are utilized, you have to report on that. Report comes out twice every year. But the question is, are we getting all the reports we're getting as to what the monies are being used, state funds, as to what they're being used for? GNPC, that is taking 30% of the oil revenue into private exploitation. The citizens whose money it is have no knowledge of what those projects are, where they're located, how much they are involved, what level of risk there is. And as to whether we can align those projects to national priorities, to national aspirations, no, they are not. So there's a huge disconnect between how state resources are being used on private projects and what the citizens itself would ask for. Ideally, there should be nothing wrong with public funds being used in such projects, but provided they are in line with national aspirations. Provided they are in line with national aspirations. And this is the issue, not just with Ghana, but it's in many African countries. This is where the problem lies. Let's have a quick scan of the various countries that have been mentioned here over and over and over again. And you find a similar trend flowing through all the countries. One, there's very limited or no public oversight. I would wish that institutions represented here that are providing support one way or the other would focus on Parliament. Because many a times we assume that Parliament is a super body that seems to know all. And yet that is where the buck should stop. And they lack, I mean, they are technically bankrupt. These are the same guys who are supposed to ratify contracts, ratify loans, ratify how, how our resources are being used. And if they lack the knowledge in the sector, then you can imagine what happens in the sector. Weak institutions, I mean, it's been mentioned over and over again. I'm not going to repeat that. Information asymmetry. We have the big players in the country. Chevron, I mean, mention all the big players. They all come to Africa. The depth of knowledge and skill they come with. Perhaps Nigeria as a country that I would say will have that level of knowledge. But many African countries that have been listed here cannot match the skill, the depth of skill that these companies come with. And so it creates imbalance in the relationship. And so if you have your government investing, gambling in such an area with that imbalanced knowledge, your guess is as good as mine. It's not surprising that in the wake of all these confusions and the fact that our resources are not benefiting us the way it should, in the past 15 or 20 or 15 years or so, the chorus that we keep singing is transparency and accountability. It's been the chorus. Please pardon me, but it's a chorus that the Chinese sing, and I ask myself whether they believe it. It's a chorus that national governments sing, and we all know they don't like it. It's a chorus that civil society sing, but do we really have the capacity to engage? Multilateral agencies and bilateral agencies sing the same chorus, transparency and accountability, as to how our resources are being utilized. Perhaps they're tired of the grants and the loans that are not making any impact in Africa. The critical question we keep asking ourselves is, in managing our own resources as Africans, how much are we putting, how much effort are national governments putting in terms of in terms of streamlining our investment agenda? Scan around the continent and you can find only few countries that can boast of national development strategies, long-term development agendas. And I believe that if African governments have long-term development agendas, this is what will actually guide our spending pattern. This is what will guide our investment. This is what will guide how we utilize our resources. Ghana hasn't got one. I don't think Nigeria has any. I doubt how many countries in Africa can boast of long-term development strategy that can actually inform spending priorities, which is a critical area. Let me conclude by saying that it would be helpful for African nations to come to the realization that the responsibility to develop Africa rests on us. We don't have to wait for outsiders to come and show us how to do it. Why am I saying this? The situation in Ghana, the situation in Sierra Leone, in Tanzania, in Mali, in Guinea, there are peculiarities, and it will be helpful that in developing our spending strategies, in developing our accountability mechanisms, in developing our oversight actors, parliament, civil society, we align this to national structures, not just a one-size-fits-all. That we align this to national structures. Somebody mentioned the EITI. Yes, indeed, it's been helpful, but if it's implemented as one-size-fits-all, and so for all other initiatives that are introduced into Africa, the OGPs, the IB, the budget initiatives, if all these are introduced into Africa just the way they are, or one size fits all, then I'm afraid that we're not going to get anywhere with that. On that note, let me say I would end here. It's unfortunate that my gadget is gone off. I'll end here and then I will take questions from there.
I will be as fast as possible so that we have some time to discuss before the bus goes. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to preface my remarks by reflecting on what I said this morning about the OECD report on the informal sector being 2/3 of labor globally and on global shell games. I do actually have a Christmas present for Evren and Hani called The World in 2015, but it's in my bag that maybe will bring my suit overnight, because that too has very interesting data on the way in which the world is changing, particularly the balance between the American and the Chinese economies in terms of PPP. But I think we also have to recognize, particularly this week, the decline in commodity prices, the decline in certainly the BRICS and some of the other emerging market currencies. And my own work on transnational initiatives has been very much influenced not just by EITI and AGRA, Gavi, the ACT Alliance, etc., but also by being involved in our new PhD in global governance and human security that Jason is part of, and certainly Fantu, in a sense, was talking about. So I'm particularly concerned with post-2015 as in a sense a marker, and whether it could be a turning point in terms of agency rather than dependency, the development of developmental states rather than fragile states. I'm also concerned with this emerging energy, food, land and water nexus that is receiving increasing attention, and again I think is of particular relevance and resonance in Africa. But at the same time, the transnational relations of shadow banking, shell companies, money laundering, crime and gangs. And here I think it's important to note that Kofi Annan has been important not only in terms of the Africa Progress Panel, but also in terms of the establishment after the Latin American and after the Global Commissions on Drugs, the West African Commission on Drugs, that's attempting to take preemptive action in terms of the supply chains of drugs moving away from Central America and the Caribbean towards West Africa, and the phenomenon of narco states in West Africa, in addition to obviously states that are very much dominated by raw materials, particularly petroleum. There has then been a development of the literature on resource governance and the development of the literature on agency, and I was interested in the comment on the Angola model because Lucy Corkin has done a very interesting study of the degree to which Angola's development is a result of its own policy rather than China's Exim Bank. And Brown and Harmon have similarly done interesting work along with Lorenz and Rempe on African agency. The paper also refers to some of the issues that Brian raised in terms of alternative sources of funding, such as sovereign wealth funds, exchange-traded funds, sovereign bonds, and here let me note the degree to which Africa has returned to the bond market when previously only South Africa was part of it. The phenomenon, of course, of faith-based organizations and the emergence of a variety of new forms of funding, which I'll come on to in a minute. Partially because of an interest in international relations, and partially because of an interest in the debate about whether American decline and Eurozone difficulties, the Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece and Spain, plus of course Cyprus and to some extent Iceland, means that the BRICS and the emerging markets have a clearer field than they might otherwise have had, and the degree to which Africa can therefore exploit this situation in terms of its own agency, recognizing, I would argue, that African agency began to be enhanced because of the Kimberley process ahead of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And again, in terms of Jason's question, the degree to which the EITI, Dodd-Frank, EU, are compatible or incompatible. The paper also talks about the emergence of new forms of regionalism, particularly the tripartite free trade agreement, some of the valley, river valley agreements, the trans-frontier peace parks, etc. And notes obviously the post-Washington consensus context. I also think it's worth reflecting on some of the changes in capitalism, including in this case not just Indian or Brazilian, but also Chinese and Russian, although the latter one may be particularly distinctive. And the way in which particularly natural resource governance has has evolved, particularly with the amalgamation of the Oxford group with the Revenue Watch International. But I also suggest that there are some new security complexes and nexuses that we need to deal with. And I thought the discussion today on the degree to which resource extraction and conflict can coexist or not, certainly in the case of Congo, obviously, all sorts of forms of resources are being extracted at the same time the conflict continues, although obviously there is a price to be paid. But whether that will continue with Dodd-Frank, I think is an important question to be posed. So the paper concludes with asking questions which I started the day with in terms of whether this will lead to innovative forms of analysis in terms of frameworks and paradigm shifts and in terms of policy. So in conclusion, I think there's some very interesting dimensions in terms of natural resource governance out of Africa. I think we haven't paid enough attention today to the role of diasporas, some of which are represented by some of us, some of you here. Certainly remittances have become a very important part of the flow of resources, and to some extent conditionalities. And we have begun to refer to the role of Mo Ibrahim in terms of the several aspects of his activities in Africa. We had a bit of a discussion earlier today about state-owned enterprises versus emerging multinational companies, and my friend from Dalhousie and then OECD, Dayton Johnson, has begun to do some very interesting work on the rise of the middle class in terms of Latin America, but that's true in Africa, certainly true in Asia, etc. And I've been very interested, coming out of debates about the new forms of development, on the focus on global value chains as a way of approaching both development and some of the new forms of regulation, voluntary and other, and the degree to which clearly in the north some of the regulations both of the EU, of the US, but also of supermarket chains and others are in fact quite authoritative. So I conclude by looking at the whole question of global governance and African agency, and in a sense reflecting Fantu, the way in which a set of issues, alliances, networks, partnerships, initiatives and visions might yet become more authoritative post-2015, not in the way that the UN post-2015 debate has suggested, but in ways in which I think new actors, new relationships are likely to head us. So we have about 12 minutes for discussion. Who's going to begin?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just have one question and a comment. I was hoping you would go a bit more into that, the slide before last, where you have that the title of neoliberalism in crisis, yada yada. And I wanted to just ask you, because I actually had meant to touch on that because Haifang raised this issue earlier this morning on the issue of development versus democracy, which kind of links to that, and this whole Beijing consensus thing versus the Washington consensus. So I just wanted to just 1 minute on your view on that, if it's okay. And my second, I also want to agree with you on the issue of the diaspora, because I went to Addis in around 2008. Then when I went back in 2012, I didn't recognize Addis. And I thought, oh, the Chinese are in town. And I was told, no, it's not the Chinese. It's the Ethiopian diaspora that has actually redeveloped. So I think that you have a very key point. But the problem I have with the diaspora issue is I think the Addis case is a bit different from some other African countries. I'm not sure they've managed to maximize the issue of development the way that Addis has done, from what I saw. This is what I want to ask you in that aspect. Because you keep mentioning the issue of the diaspora, could I hear more as to why you think it could play a strong role in that aspect? Just a liner. Thanks.
Should we take one or two more and then we can begin to respond?
Thanks, Tim. Mine actually is to you on the issue of urgency. I think one of the, and the link with human security, the outbreak of Ebola, for example, has shown that, you know, state-centered approaches, for example, to communicable diseases don't seem to be effective. I wonder what your take is in terms of moving in conversation after 2015, particularly in terms of public health and any evolution of subsequent governance structures. Thank you.
I'm curious, just to learn from you, what objectively you think as a Ghanaian, you think your country could be doing or getting it right regarding the oil, in at least one element that I think I can get from you. Thank you. I'm just saying, I just wanted to get from you in terms of what you think broadly the Ghanaian government seems to be doing right in as far as developing your extractive industry oil is concerned. In you know, any growing industry, you saw the map that was given across Africa, all these new discoveries. What is it that we can learn from Ghana? I know it's too early to say, but in your view, objectively, what do you think you seem to be getting right? Thank you.
Do you have a short answer or a long answer to that? I mean, yes or no?
Well, yes, I have a short answer to that. As I mentioned earlier on, we have the Public Interest and Accountability Committee, which was pushed by civil society groups, the Media Association, the Legal Association, various groups, 13 in total. What this group does, basically, is to follow how much money comes in, how much oil is lifted. Every single barrel should be accounted for. And so every single institution in the country, be it private or state institution, is required to provide data to this institution. It is very different, it is separate from the government, it's independent. What it does is that twice every year, it produces reports of every single barrel that comes into the country and how those monies were utilized. Now, it's there in black and white, transparency. But the other side is it accountability? Because many a time the text is technical. And so you don't get the intermediate organization like civil society and media to carry it through. So yes, what you can learn from us is to have an independent civil society audit organization that will follow every single barrel that comes through and what those monies were used for. And you can learn from where we didn't do well as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and respond on development and democracy. In part, I saw a very aging, unhappily, Amartya Sen the other day. And he did quite an interesting report for the Commonwealth at the start of the decade on the balance between the two. And I think it's very important to define democracy considerably beyond formal voting, parliaments, media, civil society, etc. On diaspora, this is another area, just like the OECD report on the informal sector, where, with all due respect, Brian, the World Bank was a bit slow because, in fact, remittances had obviously flowed well before the 21st century, but it became a focus of World Bank and other attention this century, particularly in a world in which 1 in 6, 1 in 7 of the population migrate. So the size of diasporas has grown dramatically. And interestingly, despite the global economic crisis, remittances didn't decline as much as was expected. Obviously, the role of diasporas varies
Obviously, in the case of Somalia, they're very extensive. They also sometimes return home, as in the case of post-Idi Amin Uganda or post-compression Ghana. But I think the role of diasporas is important in terms of ideas. They could be formalized in terms of voting for parliament, but I think the flow of communication and the way in which, again, the cell phone technology impacts. Several of our PhDs, particularly those from the Caribbean, have been able to move from the Caribbean to Boston, helped by aunties and uncles in the diaspora. And certainly in parts of the Caribbean, the diaspora and the local are continuously engaged. Finally, in terms of agency, in addition to people like Mo Ibrahim, I think the role of a Kofi Annan, since being Secretary General, and of course when he was Secretary General he was very important in the development of things like the UN Global Compact, but his role in terms of the Africa Progress Panel, in terms of his role in negotiating a degree of peace and constitutional change in Kenya, his role in the Africa Progress Panel, and his role now in the West African Commission and in the Peacekeeping Center is an indication that agency can be seized. I wish everybody a good evening.